Hello and welcome to the beginning of Wisdom Live. I'm Andrew Schumacher and I'm excited to be here. Oh my goodness. It's been a while since I did a live. Hang on one second. Been live a couple of other places lately, but it's been a while since I've been here. And I'm very excited to do this. I am, as the title talks about, going to be going over the next part of Hebrews. So for those of you who may have joined the channel more recently, I was in the middle of a deep dive through the book of Hebrews, and this was part of a series that it was part of one series that was also itself part of a bigger series, I guess you could say. I had looked at some teaching by 119 Ministries a while ago and just sort of some convoluted stuff they were saying about the gospel. And I decided to address that. And in addressing that, I decided to walk through verse by verse, not necessarily hitting every single verse, but hitting any relevant verses when it came to Torah observance, theology, and the gospel, and all of that, and what they say versus what does the text say, and so that started with the book of Galatians. Then I did the book of Romans, and then I got started on the book of Hebrews, and got into the book of Hebrews here. And what was kind of crazy, life got a little crazy, but we got all the way up. We saw some really cool things. Chapters 3 and 4 talking about rest and how that relates to Sabbath observance and stuff like that. But got all the way into into chapter 8, and then didn't start, and then had to stop. Just life happened, had some things come up, and I couldn't really do live streams for a while. And we're at Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7, getting right into the New Covenant prophecy citation and all of that. And there's a lot of stuff about that in, a lot of Torah observance teaching and stuff they say about it, and just had to stop right there. So I've had literally years now to think about this text. Not that I've only thought about this text, but I've had lots of time to listen to what other people say about it, that kind of thing, and get going. So I see we've got Smyrna Mountain here. Marcia, good to see you. And Gloria Sigantos. Yes, I am actually live. I'm alive, and I'm actually live. Recently, I've been live a couple other places. I was on Anthony Rogers' channel talking about this whole, Torah observance and going through a biblical theology of sin and the law. I highly recommend that. Eventually, I do plan on putting that here on this channel, but leaving it there for now. And then I also did a debate recently on the Gospel Truth channel that you can check out. That was just a week ago. So, but it's been a while since I've actually been here, and I wanted to give you guys some announcements of things I have kind of coming up. So I'm excited. I am working with a couple guys, Haps Addison and Jeffrey Rice, have started a sort of a school of apologetics for younger men who are interested in pursuing it, but needing some sort of foundation from folks that have been at it for a while. And I'm going to be teaching a course it's sort of a work. It's got a bunch of courses and things, and different teachers are going to do different things. I haven't confirmed yet exactly when. I do plan on starting that in January. and it's going to be addressing a couple of things, but it's going to be the philosophy of and philosophy in apologetics and kind of how that looks. I have been, as some of you may know, I do have a degree in philosophy, but if you've listened to the channel, if you listen to me talk at all about philosophy, you may know that I really kind of get bothered sometimes by the way that some apologists really lean hard on philosophical constructs and using logic to try to, get real fancy in the way that they do apologetics. And I just really like to go to the text. But there are a lot of things that can be learned, and it's good to have it's not so much that you need philosophy to do apologetics. You're really, if you're just a student of the word, that's kind of all you need. But what understanding a little philosophy can do for you is give you a little bit of an idea of how to analyze what other people are saying properly and that kind of thing. And so that's going to be what I'm kind of teaching on, and it'll be multiple parts and things, and at some point probably it'll end up here on the channel in some form. The thing about this is it's classes, it's interactive, so I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I'm not planning on putting anybody else's face or voice into the channel or anything like that. So, it may be, I might edit them down and just kind of have the main sort of lecture, the main sort of teaching in here. So anyway, I wanted to get into the stuff today. So the what we're going to be talking about is going to be Hebrews, the next part in our series, Hebrews 8, verses 7 through 13. And it's been a while, so let's go ahead and kind of jump in, and also we'll start with some background here. So let me pull up the slides and everything here, make sure this is looking the way it should. Awesome, that looks great. Okay, make sure my head is in the right place too. All right, so let's kind of do a little bit of some review to see where we're at, and then I may take some breaks in between to either ask you some questions or answer questions. If you have any, feel free to put them in the chat as we're going, and I'm sure I'll be able to find them. So let's start by doing a little bit of review. So this is part 5 of my deep dive. You can find the rest on the channel. It's in there. I mentioned that this is a series within a series. So there's a series called The Gospel versus Hebrew Roots or something like that. And that's the whole big series. It includes Galatians and Romans and the preliminary stuff that I talked about. But if you just want the Hebrew stuff, just look for, I think it's called Hebrews versus Hebrew Roots or something like that. And it's the, the Hebrew stuff. So you can watch the first 4 videos, which get us up to where we are now. Those videos, obviously, in 4 videos, and those ones are only hour to an hour and a half, I think, long. This one is probably going to be longer because, frankly, people are doing that more often these days, I guess. And I'm just going to get through this text, and however long it takes is how long it takes. So we might be here for a little while. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I'm excited to do it. And so, and I do, as it says here on the slide, I do intend to finish this. So let's go ahead and move forward. Now, this passage that we're going to look at in Hebrews 8, it really appears to show, as we're reading it, it shows the end of the Sinai Covenant with the coming of the New Covenant, obvious implications when we're considering the commandments of Sinai. Again, this is all related back to Torah observance. And, I want to point out, I may use the term Hebrew roots at times because that Torah observance is part of that. I'm really in this entire presentation talking about Torah observance, and that's the main thing, is what is the relationship in the text to the belief that Christians need to be eating kosher, keeping the Sabbath, those kinds of things, the way, doing those things the way that ancient Israel did them. Now, there's the next point here. Insertion of the word covenant by translators occurs in verse 7 and 13, and those are perceived weak points that Torah observance people can use to push back against the traditional interpretation that this is about, the new covenant basically replacing the original Sinai Covenant. Torah observance folks don't usually address the reasons why translators do that. They basically just say, oh, it's bias, and then they kind of move on and present their own ideas, is what typically happens. In past parts of this series, I've dealt with, in a general way, with various Torah observance and Hebrew roots arguments. So I've kind of talked about those as they've come up. But this time, and going forward, I'm going to interact with a commentary by Tim Hegg, who he's a scholar who teaches Torah observance. So I'm going to actually be looking at a specific commentary and spending some time with it. Tim's son is Caleb Hegg, who's been on the channel, and I've been on his channel. He's a Christian and a friend, but we definitely disagree on this issue. Now, Tim, I believe, is the best when it comes to scholarship from the Torah observance position. There's not a lot of good scholarship coming from that position, but I think Tim does know the languages. He at least, has studied them and is not unfamiliar. And he knows history, and he's read a lot of things. That's why I think calling him a scholar is absolutely valid. But he does come from that position, and we're going to basically be examining some of his arguments around this text as we go. All right, so let's get into the text. And so we'll go ahead and read it, and then we will start talking about it. So Hebrews 8, 7 through 13. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and I did not care for them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they will not teach each one his fellow citizen, and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them. For I will be merciful to their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. When he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. All right. So, quick overview of what we've read. All but the first and last verse of this passage are a citation of Jeremiah 31, verse 31 to 34, the primary prophecy concerning the new covenant. And it's the only time the new covenant is mentioned by name in the Old Testament. Verse 7 and 13, the bookend verses, right before and after the citation, don't contain the Greek term for covenant, but it is often inserted by the translators. Torah observance folk claim this is due to bias, so we're going to examine that along with other issues. Before we jump into that too much, I just want to double check, make sure everything's going good in the chat here. Y'all can hear me okay, see the slides okay. We haven't messed anything up, have we? I'm watching that. Oh, and it looks like, let me just make sure. Sorry, if you see that moving around, it's because I'm moving some things. It looks like these slides are a little too big right now. on your screen. So we want to fix that. Sorry, I'm moving things around on you. Okay, let's see here. That looks right. Yeah, there we go. Now you can see the whole thing. Okay, so everything looks good. I see a big thumbs up there by Random T Chance. Nice to see you. Okay, so here we go. Let's continue in the text. Sorry for moving those around. Okay. So here are the issues we're going to address. The insertion of covenant in verse 7, is that proper? And really, verse 13 as well, as we will see. We're going to address what is the new covenant, with whom is the new covenant made, what are the God's laws written on the heart, who knows God in this covenant, and what exactly is obsolete and growing old. All right, so let's talk about that first issue, the insertion of covenant into the verse. So translators do often insert covenant. It's not in the original Greek. That's why you see it italicized in many translations. So a closer translation to the actual Greek would say something like, if that first one had been faultless, or if that first had been faultless. The question is, that first what? So let's look at it. It says, verse 6 says, so this is it's a pronoun, that first. So what could it be referring to? Let's go back to the prior verse. It says, but now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, liturgius, to the extent that he's also the mediator of a better covenant, diathekes, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first one, ekaine, there's that pronoun there, had been free of fault, no circumstance would have been sought for a second. Now, grammatically, the pronoun in verse 7 could refer to one of two things. So, ekaine is the pronoun. It means that, or that one. It could refer back to liturgius or diathekes. Those are the only nouns in the prior sentence. If you look at this, these are screenshots from Bible Hub. The bottom line there gives us the Greek, all the Greek fancy stuff. The N stands for noun, G stands for genitive case, F stands for female gender, S stands for singular. So we have a genitive female singular noun, and we have two of them in the previous verse. So what this means grammatically in Greek, I'm not a super big expert on Greek, but I do understand when you have a pronoun that refers back to a noun, generally they need to match, but they don't always have to. And sometimes, and in some verses, they don't on purpose. I don't know what the case is here. I don't know enough about Greek, but you see the pronoun, it's got a different case. It's nominative, not genitive, but again, that may just be related to how it functions in the sentence, as opposed to the other terms. But notice both that it's also female singular, so or feminine, I should say, not female, feminine singular, so just like both of these terms. So grammatically in Greek, we have nothing to favor either the term ministry or the term covenant. It's the same. If all we were looking at was this one sentence without any context, we couldn't necessarily say which thing it's referring to. But we're going to begin looking at context to see what makes the most sense. Now, the Torah observance argument, and we're going to see this when we read Tim Hegg, most of the time they try to make it, they say, well, it should refer to ministry, not covenant, and they'll give arguments for why that might be. I have heard at least one Torah observant pastor preaching on this text who didn't bother with saying that. He said, no, it's a new covenant and the old covenant's gone. But he interpreted other things other ways to make it, his theology still work. But he didn't try to do it here. He didn't try to say it was ministry, not covenant. But we're going to go ahead and look at this. So we're going to look at Tim Hegg. He's one of the best representatives of the position, and he does believe that it should refer to ministry. But I want to give you some context about the commentary that we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to read a section from the introduction to the commentary. It says this. This is Tim Hegg. I had chosen the book of Hebrews for our weekly Bible study for an obvious reason. It seems to be one of the first books in the apostolic scriptures, New Testament, to which our detractors turn to prove that the, quote, New Covenant has forever replaced the, quote, Old Covenant. Based upon their understanding of Hebrews, they are quick to point out that Torah observance is therefore no longer God's will for his children. In fact, one does not need to look very far among the many commentaries on the book of Hebrews to find well-known Christian scholars who essentially interpret Hebrews in this way as well. So my reason for choosing the book of Hebrews for our Bible study was to look carefully at the text, interpreting it in its own context, as well as in the context of the Bible as a whole, to debunk this errant theological perspective, by showing that it could not stand if one would allow the text of Hebrews to speak on its own terms. So Hegg's commentary is explicitly apologetic. So I want to make that point here. So Hegg isn't just doing a scholar thing and making a commentary in isolation and just looking at the text. He is concerned with the arguments made by people who are not Torah observant and that people like me make about this book. He asserts that his argument will debunk the traditional interpretation. He says it's all based on Hebrews' its own context as well as the context of the Bible as a whole. Claims that the traditional interpretation could not stand if one would allow the text of Hebrews to speak on its own terms. So I'm highlighting these all for a very good reason. So Hegg is setting out self-consciously to address what someone like me might say regarding this book. Now we're going to test those claims by looking at what he says about this text. This will be a long citation because I don't want to miss Hegg's entire argument concerning Hebrews 8:7. So this is Tim Hegg again. Every commentary on the Epistle of Hebrews, which I own and consulted, considers this verse to present a contrast between the New Covenant and the, quote, Old Covenant. But the first thing we should note in regard to this verse is that the word, quote, covenant, diatheke, is not found in the Greek text itself. It has been added by the translators of nearly every English translation, and as such has been greatly influential in forging the standard Christian view that the, quote, first covenant has been equated with the, quote, old covenant, or is to be equated with the, quote, old covenant, and therefore is stated, as stated in our verse, had flaws. End of the quotation. There's another section on the next page. The Greek of our verse seems to lack the completion. Again, we're back to quoting Hegg. The Greek of our verse seems to lack the completion of a conditional clause, for if we were to translate it woodenly, it would say, for if that first was flawless, never a place for a second will be sought. What is missing is the corresponding apodosis, the then, for the initial if, prodosis. But such unfulfilled conditional sentences are not uncommon in Hebrews. The fact that the sentence opens with the conditional if means that a corresponding then is implied and required. So the logic of our author is clear. If the Levitical service in the tabernacle and temples had brought a complete fulfillment of God's saving plan, then there would have been no need for a priest after the order of Melchizedek to be commissioned. Or to put it another way, the very fact that God took an oath in establishing David's master, Yeshua, as a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110:4, proves that the Levitical priesthood and the service they rendered was not God's intended means for bringing about eternal salvation of the elect. And that's the end of that citation. And I just want to point out, I've highlighted here his conclusion. Now, I'm not quoting literally everything he said, but most of it. He makes the argument that ministry is what we should have, and then he's saying, never would a reason be sought for a second means this, that if the Levitical service of the tabernacle and temple had brought complete fulfillment of God's saving plan, there would have been no need for a priest after the order of Melchizedek to be commissioned. So he is seeing the text as referring back to ministry in verse 7, not covenant. That's the point I'm making here in this citation. Next citation, again, Tim Hegg. This is from his commentary. This is the point. Our author is not contrasting two covenants, a quote first and a quote second covenant, but two priesthoods. The first, Levitical, and the second, Yeshua as the Melchizedek high priest. And this becomes even clearer when one considers the traditional Christian interpretation, which has our author referring to the Sinai Covenant as being flawed. How is it possible that the very words of the Torah given by God to Moses for Israel were flawed? So note that he is making the case. So this is his argument. This is an argument why it needs to refer back to ministry and therefore be about two priesthoods, not two covenants. Is this question: how is it possible the very words of the Torah given by God to Moses for Israel were flawed? So his argument is the words of the Torah cannot be flawed, therefore it can't be about the first covenant being not without flaw. It has to be about the priesthood. That's the argument. And this is the crux of the argument. So based on the problem with his problem, this is Hegg's problem with the word flawed, he argues that verse 7 can't be referring to the Sinai Covenant. He goes on, I'm not quoting every single thing in the commentary, but as you'll see, his argument really isn't any deeper than this. If you read the commentary, he basically does what I did at the start to show, look, there's these two words, and covenant doesn't appear in verse 7. It should really refer to ministry, not covenant, because the covenant can't be flawed because the words of the Torah can't be flawed. That's the argument. He goes on, he cites a couple of commentators with whom he disagrees, so I'm not going to go through all those. But then he writes this. In pure contrast to this, that is the commentators he doesn't agree with, the words of the psalmist ring in our ears. The Torah of Adonai is perfect, teminah, meaning I could be flawless, restoring the soul, Psalm 19, verse 7. Once again, however, the majority of Christian commentators take it for granted that our verse is contrasting a first covenant with a second covenant. But the next verse, which is already referenced by the quote above, speaks differently. The flaw or fault is not with God's Torah covenant, but with the people. All right, and just double checking here. Yeah. Okay, yeah, everything. Just making sure y'all can still see things good. I saw a little note coming up. All right. So, what's going on? Tim Hegg has given us here again his point that he thinks it's not going with the commentary of, he's not going with these other guys. He's saying, it cannot be because of what Psalm 19 says. Therefore, it cannot be the case that the Torah is, or that this is about the two covenants, because clearly the Torah is perfect. The law of the Lord is perfect, as Psalm 19 says. Now, is this a good argument? Is this a good argument? So we're going to go ahead and take a look. All right. So we've read the argument, and that's his point. His entire argument is based on that flawed cannot refer to the words of the Torah. Now, a lot of Torah observance folks who aren't making his argument, they still point to where it says finding fault with them, as in the people, as a reason that it was about people. So I want to point this out, that the text as we read it, it says finding fault with them, he says, and then it goes on to cite the New Covenant prophecy. And it says, see, it's not about the words of the Torah being flawed, it's about the people. And so there are a lot of people who, now Hegg makes the point that it's about the people who are the priests. It's about the priests being flawed in a certain way, that what they do can't bring about salvation, as we read. But there are others who don't take Hegg's position that this is all about the priesthood, who nevertheless point to where it says finding fault with them, and they say, well, it's about the people. So let's keep that in mind as we continue forward. Now, let's test the argument. So, were the words of the priesthood, remember what he says, the words of the Torah cannot be flawed. Were the words of the priesthood, the regulations and guidelines given for the priesthood, flawed? Can a covenant as well as a priesthood have flawed people in it? And then, do we or Hegg have any other good reasons to reject his argument that the word flawed somehow disqualifies the word covenant from being the appropriate referent in verse 7? So these are the questions we're going to wrestle with. So, wrestling with the question of the words. Now, obviously, Hegg, he says the words of the Torah, the whole Torah, obviously the whole Bible, are perfect. They're flawless. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the words of the Bible. Hegg would clearly say, and I would agree, that no, the words regarding the priesthood, that is the regulations and guidelines given for priests, those aren't flawed. The words that establish them they can't be flawed. The very words of the Torah are not flawed, right? That's what Hegg's already said. And that obviously applies to stuff with the priesthood as well. So we're not finding any issues, we're not finding any disagreement when we're talking about the words. But then let's ask this question, because remember, finding fault with them, maybe it's about people. Well, the other question is, can a covenant as well as a priesthood have flawed people in it? Now, he's arguing that the Levitical priesthood was not God's intended mean for bringing about eternal salvation of the elect. That's the way that he is speaking of the priesthood being, quote, flawed, because it doesn't do this really important thing. It doesn't bring about salvation. But this is a text. This again a quote from the commentary, kind of going into that. It says, note very carefully how our author introduces Jeremiah's prophecy of the new covenant, which he quotes from Jeremiah 31 through 34. He does not write, quote, for finding fault with it, end quote, meaning a covenant, but rather, quote, with them. And he gives the Greek. That is, with the people, including the Levitical priests. So notice what he says, with the people, including the Levitical priests. So he's pointing out what we've mentioned a few times. It's finding fault with the people, not with the words. That's what the text is about. Let's look at that. So here we see Hegg is quoting, he's locating the flaw or fault with the people, and I would agree. But again, that works for the covenant just as well as for the priesthood. If that's where the flaw is, or where the fault is with the people, then we no longer have an argument against the covenant for the priesthood or the ministry. We just have something that really equally applies to both. And in fact, when it comes to the commandments, remember, we're talking, when we talk about regulations and words related to the priesthood, we're talking about commandments. Hegg himself is okay with commandments being spoken of as in some sort of denigrating way in a sense in the Bible, because it does so, based on the fact that it's about the people. So, and Hegg himself is okay with that, as we'll see in this quote. So this is from earlier in the commentary. This is talking about chapter 7. We have this quote from Hegg, and I'll begin reading. this is Hebrews 7, verses 18 and 19. For on the one hand, there is a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness, for the Torah made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. That section, of course, is just citing Hebrews. But then these are Hegg's words. After a little bit of an ellipsis there, this is what he has to say about this section. He says, moreover, it is set aside as regards the heavenly high priest because while it functioned to maintain the earthly priesthood, this priesthood was never designed nor purposed to bring about eternal salvation. Thus, while the earthly priesthood was given to reveal the ultimate and eternal high priest, describing the essence of his work in dramatic revelation, as pertains to eternal salvation, the earthly priesthood was both, quote, weak and, quote, useless. And he gives the Greek. Meaning that the offering of the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin, for the sacrificial system was not given by God for that purpose. End of the quote from the commentary. So, coming back to this question. So the text is clear that the commandment, and Hegg is clear, the commandment is called weak and useless in chapter 7. The commandment is called weak and useless, not just the people. The people aren't called weak and useless. The commandment is called weak and useless. But that is because the law made nothing perfect. So the presence of imperfect people trying to keep that law again is what allows Scripture to refer to the commandments of the law as weak and useless. Does that make sense? So the commandments can be called weak and useless as long as we understand why. Because of the people. The law is not making the people perfect. The people are imperfect. The law is weak and useless as regards making people perfect, because people aren't perfect. So he's fine with them being called that. But again, if he's fine with that, what's so special about the word fault as opposed to weak or useless? Obviously, we wouldn't just in general say that the word of God is weak and useless, or that the scriptures or the Torah or any of these other terms we use, that it's just weak and useless without any context. When we consider it in light of the people, that's where we start to see, where that makes sense. But now we're just dealing with a different word, fault. Not without fault is the phrase in the text. And here's the thing. We can look elsewhere outside of Hebrews as well. So we saw it again in Hebrews, just the chapter before the one we're examining. But also we find this in Romans. In Romans 8, 1 through 4, we find this same way of talking about the law. It says, therefore, there is now no condemnation at all for those who are in Christ Jesus, for the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and of death. For what the law could not do, weak as it was, through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and as an offering for sin. And as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Notice, it says the law was weak. It could not do something because it was weak through the flesh. So because of people, the law is called weak. But then what it couldn't do, God did by sending his Son. So Romans 8, 1 through 4 is not about any priesthood at all. It's clearly about everyone, and it's about the law. And it makes the same argument we're seeing in both Hebrews 7 and Hebrews 8. There's no real difference. They're all talking about how, what God set out, whether it's in terms of law and commandments or in terms of covenant. When it comes to the words, there's nothing wrong with the words themselves, but they are weak, useless, or not without fault because of them, because of the people. And Hegg is, as we saw, is okay with that reasoning everywhere except Hebrews 8 for some reason. And he doesn't give us any clear reason why it has to be different in Hebrews 8, other than what you've heard so far. But again, we've established that it's not about the words, it's about the people. So Hegg's insistence that Hebrews 8:7 can't refer to the first covenant because the phrase "not faultless" falls flat. Really, his own reasoning on Hebrews 7 shows that he's okay with that kind of language, and then we also saw that in Romans 8. If a commandment concerning priests can be useless, remember, he thinks it's about priests, but then we're still dealing with commandments. We're still dealing with people. So if the commandment about priests can be not without fault because of the priests, a commandment about a covenant, or about a covenant containing commandments, can also be not without fault if it's concerning the people. And for the same reason, so he says, if a commandment concerning priests can be useless and the law can be useless for the same reason that it cannot save us, Hegg hasn't really given us any reason why the Sinai Covenant, which contains all those laws, priesthood or otherwise, cannot be spoken of as not faultless when it contains members who are sinners, just like the priesthood contains members who are sinners. So the next question, so we kind of established that. I mean, the covenants can contain people, and that can be what it's about. He hasn't given us really any reason to go against that interpretation that we've seen in other texts. Next question that we looked at is, do we or Hegg have any other good reasons to reject his argument that this word somehow disqualifies the word covenant from being an appropriate referent in verse 7? Is he giving us any other good reasons? Now, we already read his entire argument. This is his argument. We already read this. In pure contrast to this, the words of the psalmist ring in our ears. These are Hegg's words. The Torah of Adonai is perfect, restoring the soul. Psalm 19:7. And again, and continuing to read Hegg, once again, however, the majority of Christian commentators take for granted that our verse is contrasting a first covenant with a second covenant. But the next verse, which is already referenced in the quote above, speaks differently. The flaw or fault is not with God's Torah covenant, but with the people. And again, there may be a way that these commentators may be saying it that rubs him the wrong way. Maybe it would rub me the wrong way. That's not my point here. My point here is that Hegg is trying to argue that that verse 7, Hebrews 8:7, must be referring to ministry, as in the priesthood, and not covenant, because of his argument here. But he undermines his own argument right there at the end when he says the flaw or fault is with the people. Because if it's with the people, then it still can be referring to the covenant without any of his other problems making any dent. We can say the covenant is not without fault because it contains people who are not without fault. And we're not talking about the literal words of the covenant. So that's so he's really undermining his own argument here. All right. So then it's faulty reasoning. So he's saying the Torah is perfect, while also saying a part of it is not perfect, that part pertaining to priests. Because that's his only other option. The only way he can say, oh, no, it must be the part about the priests, is if the actual words about the priests had some sort of fault with them. And he said, no, the overall covenant can be, has to be perfect, but a part of it can be faulty. That wouldn't make any sense, because obviously if any part is faulty, then the whole thing is faulty, has a fault in it. But again, if it's about the people, there's no fault with the words, but then it still can be about the covenant. So I think we've kind of hit that point. All right. So just to recap, the grammar alone allows for either term. So the grammar doesn't narrow it down. It doesn't favor ministry. It doesn't favor covenant. So when translators put in the word covenant, they're not doing it based on the grammar alone. They're doing it based on context. Tim Hegg is trying to give us a reason to go with the other one based on context. But as we've seen, his argument doesn't really establish anything. It doesn't give us any reason over and above, it doesn't give us any reason to favor ministry over covenant. When it's about the people, that's kind of the issue. So we haven't seen any positive evidence pointing us toward ministry. He hasn't given us anything that says, no, this is a real good reason why it must be about that. But let's continue. Now, he had to jump outside of Hebrews. He had to go to Psalm 19 to talk about, the law of the Lord is perfect, that phrase, in order to try to establish his point. But we don't need to do that. We don't need to go outside of Hebrews. We're going to go ahead and just look at the actual text to see which one do we think is most likely in view in verse 7. So the thing is, chapter 7, the previous chapter was all about priesthoods. It's contrast between Jesus. I mean, that's the kind of this whole book. The whole book of Hebrews is, let's draw a contrast between Jesus and something and show how Jesus is greater than that something. He's supreme. He's so much greater. So in chapter 7, it was a contrast between Jesus Melchizedek priesthood and the Levitical priesthood that's found in the Torah. And it shows how much superior Jesus is to the Torah in that case, as regards his priesthood. Then there's this transition as we get into chapter 8, and we're going to see, how it really is. Let's just look at the evidence and see where it goes. So, chapter 7 we saw is about priesthoods. Now let's look at some key words in chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 8, and now we're not inserting the words here. These are in the Greek. Verse 8 says, I will complete a new covenant. Verse 9 says, not like the covenant with their fathers, and they did not continue in my covenant. These are found in both, so 2 times in verse 9 and verse 10. This is the covenant I will decree with the house of Israel. Now all of this is coming from the Jeremiah citation. So we see multiple times covenant is said, unsurprisingly, in the great new covenant prophecy in Jeremiah. So what we don't see are the terms ministry or priesthood. That term that we saw in verse 6 before verse 7, that it could refer back to, ministry and priesthood are not discussed in any of these verses. They're not, that come after verse 7. And in fact, if, let's go ahead and read them all together and see what's likely to be talking about. I'm going to go ahead and leave out the inserted instances of covenant. So I'm going to slightly redo it so it's just a little closer to the Greek where covenant has been inserted by translators. So it's not going to be in those spots, but it is going to be where it actually is in the Greek. And let's see, what do we think is being talked about in this passage? So starting in verse 6, where we have ministry and covenant both, it says, but now he has obtained a more excellent ministry by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and I did not care for them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Notice, verse 6 is we're introduced to the idea of this covenant. Jesus has a more excellent ministry, a more excellent priesthood, because he's the mediator of a better covenant. Then it goes on to say in verse 7, just after the part where it's inserted, I will effect a new covenant. Verse 9, not like the covenant. Verse 9 again, they did not continue in my covenant. Verse 10, this is the covenant I will make. Do you think this passage might be about a covenant, or is it about a priesthood? And again, we know that so that alone should give us a big hint about what the text is really addressing. But then there's another thing. So there's another way. So priesthood isn't used or ministry isn't used, but the new covenant is all the people. It's not just the priesthood. Is there any indication this text is concerning all the people and not just the priests? Well, let's look at that. Verse 8 says, a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Who's that? That's all the people, right? He made this covenant. It says, with their fathers on the day when I took hold of them, led them out of Egypt. Again, their fathers. Who did he lead out of Egypt? All of Israel. With the house of Israel again, that's the whole house. I will be their God. They will be my people. Is that just priests? No. They will not teach each one his fellow citizen, fellow priest or fellow citizen. This is about all the people. It says, I will be merciful. I will not remember their sins. Again, is this about just the priests or is this about all of the people? So this text is concerning, it repeats over and over the covenant, and it also makes multiple references to all of the people. So when it talks about finding fault with them and the people, is the text more likely to be saying finding fault with the people in the covenant, all the people, or is it just about the priests? Again, we don't see priesthood, we don't see ministry. We do see lots of references to covenant and lots of references to all the people. So it's concerned with the people. It is not concerned with comparing priesthoods. That's not what's happening in the New Covenant prophecy. So when we look at verse 7 and where it's inserted, if that first covenant had been faultless, it's really just being faithful to the whole surrounding context of the passage. There's no question about that. And, we have to, as we've seen, arguing for it to be ministry requires making dubious claims dependent on completely different context. Hegg had to go run over to Psalm 19, to just one of his favorite texts about the law, which I love it too. I mean, the law of the Lord is perfect. It's God's commandments to his people. It's the scriptures. It's perfect. I have no problem with that. That's not the question. The question is that first covenant, the one made at Sinai. And again, notice it says that first covenant and then, a second covenant. And then it talks, when he's citing this, it says it's a new covenant, not like the first not like the one made at Sinai. So that's going on in there too. So again, Hegg had to go to a psalm that's clearly not about this topic. That's just about, it's poetry about the law, to find just a lofty sounding verse. And that's what he based his entire argument on for why, not without fault or not flawless could not refer to the first covenant, i.e. the one made at Sinai. As we've seen, there's nothing to his argument, really. I mean, he hasn't given us anything. So, is he doing what he promised to do? Is he interpreting the book of Hebrews in its own context? Not really. Or, the language of the book on its own terms. He's not really doing that. Now, consider these comparative terms. We have a lot of comparative terms here in Hebrews chapter 8 and around it. The terms old, new, first, second, better, obsolete, growing old, disappearing, all these terms. Some of these terms are inarguably being used to describe covenants. New covenant appears many, many times in there, right? None of them, not one of these terms, is used to describe either the Levitical or Melchizedek priesthood. And that goes for the book. I mean, Hebrews 7, where it's talking about the two priesthood, it's talking about how superior Jesus' priesthood is, how superior Melchizedek is. It doesn't talk about the priesthoods as new, old, first, second, those kinds of temporal comparative terms, things being obsolete and growing old, as it talks about later on. None of that language is ever explicitly used of priesthoods. So again, Hegg is arguing, and Torah observance folks are having to argue something that they don't have any actual concrete examples for to make that work. It's just another contextual reason to say this is really referring to the first covenant. All right, and here's some examples. So we have, 8:6 is a better covenant. 8:8 and 9:15 both say a new covenant. 9:15, now this is later in Hebrews, the next chapter, it actually does use the first covenant. So this is like one time we have the word first where it does have a direct object, and that direct object is covenant. That comes a little later, but again, that should affect how we interpret the text when we see, well, how does this book use these terms? So that's another one. And Hebrews 9:15 it's interesting. It actually says first covenant, and it's followed closely by 9:18, which is looking back at it and says the first, just like Hebrews 8:7 did. If the first had not been without fault. And so I quote 9:15 through 18 here to show you that. It says, "For this reason, he is a mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant," and that's not inserted, that's in the Greek, "those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never in force when the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first," and this time covenant is inserted. I didn't put it in italics there, but it is. Literally says, "Even the first was not inaugurated without blood." So we have here an example where it literally says the first covenant, and it says the first without the word covenant, and it's speaking of, obviously, the first covenant. So in Hebrews, we have a concrete example of the first covenant. We have no concrete examples in the entire book of the first priesthood or the first ministry. So again, Hegg is arguing, and other Torah observance folks who take this line are arguing it based on a very, very flimsy foundation. They're not basing it on the book of Hebrews. They're not getting their argument from there. Now, I would ask even, have you ever heard any Torah observance person point out the parallels between what we have here in 9:15 and 18 and 8:6 and 7? Have you ever seen anyone ever really go to it? Hegg does mention 9:15 having this term first covenant as anticipatory of the new covenant. He does do that, but he doesn't really address whether it might influence how we read the chapter. Again, he talks about it when he gets to the next chapter of his commentary on chapter 9 in a footnote, but he doesn't reference back to chapter 8 at all. So that's, it's interesting. Like, you would think, when he's talking about all this stuff with the first and not having the word covenant in there, that he might look at the other instances where that happens. Well, one of them is the very next chapter in a situation where it absolutely must mean covenant, just like it certainly can grammatically do so here in chapter 8. All right, so another issue we have where it does seem that there's another way of looking at the text is the links. So verses 6 through 8, they're not in the text in isolation. They're not just independent statements. They're all linked. Let's look at them again. It says, "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For, finding fault with them, he says, Behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." So notice these connections. He obtained the more excellent ministry by being the mediator of a new covenant. And then it goes on to say, for the first. Now, what does the for mean? The for is going back to, well, how is he the mediator of a better covenant? What's going on with that? And it continues to connect it. So he's summing up his prior discussion of the superior ministry in verse 7. So he mentions the ministry one last time. Now, it's not that he never mentions it again in the entire book, but he mentions it for the last time in this whole section. And now he's providing things at more and more basic level of what that ministry was built upon. Each link is a step toward the more foundational truths that support the way, my words are wrong here, but basically support moving away from the Levitical to the Melchizedek priesthood of Christ. The final statement in this argument about the priesthood is verse 6. So he's made his final statement about the priesthood, and he tells us more about what it's based on. And that's what he goes on to say. He says, now he's obtained a more excellent ministry by as much as he's the mediator of a better covenant. The basis of his ministry is the better covenant. So that's the more foundational item. And it's enacted on better promises, which is foundational to the covenant. And then that, it says, for if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no reason for the second. So he's pointing out, hey, he's built this stuff on the new covenant, the better covenant, foundationally, because the first one wasn't, it had fault in that it had people who kept sinning and breaking the covenant. So it's connected to that prior statement. And it goes on for finding fault with them, and he goes on to cite the new covenant. So he gives us the reason, the foundation for why there's a new covenant is because the people were breaking the first covenant, and it couldn't save them. So put it another way, it says, God's sovereign promise to solve the fault in man by means of a new covenant is the ultimate basis for why he was always going to change from one covenant to another. All right. So from verse 6 to 8, we hear about the author's reasoning about why a new covenant is going to come about. He has a more excellent ministry on the basis of the better covenant. The better covenant is coming about because the first was not faultless. The fault mentioned is the people not continuing in the covenant, as then explained by the reference to the Jeremiah prophecy. Translators are not without good reason for thinking verse 7 refers to a covenant. There's lots of good reason there for that to be the case. All right. Finally, then, if the first and second refer to priesthoods, as opposed to, this is just another thing to notice about the text, then verse 7 doesn't make sense. The Melchizedek priesthood is the first priesthood. It's found in Genesis before Moses ever came on the scene and before the Levitical priest found in the Torah ever came to be. The Melchizedek priesthood was already there. Verse 7 says, the fault with the first caused a second to be sought. Think about that. If the first is a priesthood, then what it's saying is the fault in that priesthood caused people to look for a second priesthood. And Jesus did come later. The promise that he would be this priest did come later, comes in the Psalms. But it's not the second priesthood. The priesthood, Jesus was the next person to hold it, but he wasn't. But the priesthood wasn't the second. The Melchizedek priesthood is not the second priesthood. It's the first. So if verse 7 is about priesthoods, it is nonsense because it's flipping the order. The order, the Melchizedek priesthood came first. So it's a minor point, but again, it doesn't make sense following Tim Hegg's reasoning. All right. So we've kind of looked at that. Yes, verse 7 pretty much should be about covenants, not priesthoods. And by extension, we'll see that with verse 13 as well after this citation. But now we're going to look at this new covenant prophecy and kind of look at some of the details of it. So that's the next section here. I'm going to pause real quick, just see how things are going in the chat. I hope you guys are doing good. Take a little drink here. All right, so don't see any questions. People just I hope you're all enjoying it. Let me know if you are. Random T chance, context is king. You're absolutely right. And yeah, and you're right. So you said the problem with the law is it could not be kept until Jesus kept it. Exactly. No mere human could ever do it. And so it, that's why part of the reason it was given to demonstrate that, right? Demonstrate that fault in the people. All right, let's take a look. Here we go. What is the new covenant? All right, so we won't really have time to discuss everything about the new covenant today, but I do want to look at some things in this text that we can learn about the new covenant from it. And we know it's a citation of Jeremiah that will come into play, but we're just going to kind of look at it as it appears in Hebrews and see what we can learn. So here's some things we can glean, descriptions of this new covenant based on the text we're looking at. Verse 8 says it's new, so that's something. Verse 8 says it's with Israel and Judah. It says with the house of Israel, house of Judah. Verse 9 says it is not like the covenant made with Israel when they left Egypt. So that is a very good description of exactly what happened at Sinai, right? God made the covenant at Sinai with Israel at that time. The new covenant is not like that covenant, according to verse 9. Verse 10 says it was made with Israel, and this time Judah is not mentioned again. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. This is, as a side note, it's not really the point of what we're discussing today, but I will just point this out, that the verse 10 and verse 8, if you believe in two-house theory, if you believe that all the believers are somehow members of the house of Israel, the northern tribes, and the house of Judah is the southern tribes, and it's not that that's not the case, in many texts, but if you take this to the sort of extreme that we're all members of this northern tribes of Israel, and therefore we're all under the same covenant as them, and that all that kind of argumentation that happens in two-house theory. Verse 10 kind of messes up your theory, because if we have to do a hard, fast distinction between house of Israel and house of Judah, then that means that all of the details, God says I'm making a new covenant with both houses, but then all the details of the covenant are only with the house of Israel, and it's like, so the southern kingdom, house of Judah, is just left out. Obviously that's not the case. The house of Israel is being made in a more general sense in this second time, to refer to all of Israel, and we will see, and we see later in the New Testament, and we do see this hints of it in the Old as well, but we see that these terms for Israel and Judah are used to then apply this to all of God's people, which is all the believers. So but I just point out, this is what this text says. I'm not really going into all of that today, but I will just point out that it does give fits to any theology that's like two-house theory. Anyway, moving on. It says, verse 10 says, God will put his laws in minds and hearts. Verse 10 also says he will be their God and they will be his people. Verse 11 says all members of the covenant will know God and so will not need to be taught to know him. And verse 12 says God will be merciful and forgive sins. So these are just kind of bullet point items that we learn about the new covenant from this text. So again, it is new. It's not a previous covenant. It's not renewed or refreshed. This isn't a renewal of the Mosaic covenant. It is a new covenant. From other parts of Hebrews in the New Testament, we see it's a fulfillment of the promise of the Abrahamic covenant. So it is not new. It's not new in the sense that there's nothing old about it. It does fulfill the promises made, that to Abraham, that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed, for example. So we learned some other things about it, but it's not that it's new in the sense that there's nothing ever said about it or there's nothing that it's tied to in the Old Testament, but it is really a new covenant. It's also new because it's based on the work of Christ, that we learn that from other texts as well. And the book of Hebrews just is laboring to teach us this throughout, that Christ is superior because he's the mediator of this new covenant. And it's going on to talk about the details about that. Second item, it's not like the covenant made at Sinai. It proves any form of what's called monocovenantalism, which is the idea that really all the covenants are just one big covenant, because this covenant is not like that covenant, according to the text. It explicitly says so. So one big covenant, no, that's not what's going on in Scripture. Hebrews the whole book is a book of contrast, and we see here its fundamental contrast is this one, between the new covenant of Christ and the Sinai covenant made through Moses. And we see this over and over and over through the text, and we'll see it. This is where we're being introduced to the new covenant here in chapter 8. As we go through subsequent chapters, Lord willing, we're going to see how it's really about contrasting these two covenants, contrasting what people had through Moses versus what we have through Christ. And we'll address questions we'll address about the prophecy, that is this text we're looking at, are the specific ways the new covenant is not like the one made at Sinai. So that's, as we'll see, this is how I take this passage. The descriptions and these bullet points, these items about the new covenant, they are all of the different ways, maybe not all of them, but a lot of different ways that the new covenant is different from the covenant made at Sinai. That's what we're seeing. All right. With whom is it made? So we're going to start digging into some of these items. And a lot of these won't be really long, but they'll just kind of hash it out. So verse 8 says, house of Israel, house of Judah. Verse 10 says, just house of Israel. So, and I kind of went over this, even though I forgot I had a slide about it. But yeah, basically, there's no way to rigidly say that house of Israel, house of Judah have to refer to these two elements of the kingdom of Israel. Yes, in some contexts they certainly do. Certainly when they're said together, they do. But when they're said together, it's then bringing it all together. So it's just about the whole. And then verse 10 is just another way of referring to the whole. Second, no one truly restricts this prophecy to the whole people of Israel, excluding Gentiles. So this is another point that's often made by Torah observance folks. The argument is made, the new covenant isn't with you. It's not with the Gentile church. It's with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But really, when we look at the details of this covenant being made, virtually nobody says, oh yeah, God not remembering sins, that's only for, Israel. That's not for the whole world. So now some do, some people say, well, there's a whole different thing, but it's not the new covenant. And again, that's maybe a view you can have, but I don't think it's certainly not. There's nothing obvious from the text itself that you can just restrict it and say, nope, it's just to this physical nation, these physical descendants of Israel. Nobody else is any of these promises for. That becomes a big problem when you get to the New Testament. So most people, again, and remember, I'm addressing Torah observance and the people in those camps. Most of them would say that it is about the physical nation of Israel, and that as believers we are grafted into that, and therefore we come under the original Sinai Covenant with them, and therefore we're part of that too. So the Gentiles don't get to be a part of that, that don't come to believe in Christ. There's some inconsistencies among different folks in that, because some would then argue that the law tells us what sin is, right? And that's for everybody. But then if that's for everybody, then it doesn't matter if we're grafted in, right? It just applies to everybody. So, and then does the new covenant not apply? How does it apply then? And it would be what most say that I've read and listened to. Most say this prophecy is not ultimately restricted to the physical descendants of Israel, because ultimately everyone who believes comes into that kingdom and into that covenant at some point. So believers, it is for other nations, other people, but not as people who are in other nations, but as people who have come to believe and come to join with God's covenant people. And I would agree with that. That's what it's about. But again, it's just saying, let's let the text, the text says house of Israel, house of Judah, but virtually everybody, no matter what your sort of eschatology and things like that, most people are gonna say that it does expand beyond that, is my main point here. And we have some examples. This is the New Covenant texts in the New Testament. Luke 22:20, and in the same way the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Again, is it only poured out for the physical descendants of Israel? I don't think anybody really thinks that. And anybody we're really talking about tonight anyway. There might be fringe groups out there. I'm not talking about them. And then the Matthew passage, after taking the cup and giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So notice that citation, that reference to forgiveness of sins, that's straight out of, it's out of many places, but also out of this new covenant prophecy. I will remember their sins no more. So there's ways you can resolve this. You can say that Gentiles are included by faith as they're grafted in, as Paul describes in Romans 11. This is the historic Christian teaching, as well as that of many Torah observance teachers. So there's, we kind of agree. We don't agree on what grafting in entails, on what it, all of the implications of that. We don't agree on that, but we agree that this text, this new covenant text, applies to Gentiles because of that, because of being grafted in. Or we can say that Gentiles are part of the 10 tribes, the two-house theory. That's what a lot of, some but not all Torah observance folks will say. Tim Hegg doesn't believe in two-house theory, by the way. So he's not in that group. Many in the Hebrew Roots movement do teach that. As we saw, that runs into big problems here in this very text. So I won't go over those again. So if I'm just going to we pretty much hit all of these points. And this is, okay. So there's no way to include Gentiles without expanding our definition of what the term Israel means, right? Hebrews has already done this, actually. My point, I do want to make this point. So it also this new covenant, this way of seeing this text does present a problem for dispensational ideas about what, that there isn't any spiritual Israel, that there are promises specifically for the physical people of Israel. This text can't really be confined that way. And in fact, the book of Hebrews also gives us some reasons not to confine it that way. Hebrews 1:14 says, "Are they not all spirits engaged in special service, sent on assignment for the sake of those who are going to inherit salvation?" Let's talk about angels. They're talking about people who will inherit salvation. That's Christians. But then Hebrews 2:16, still talking about angels again, he says, "For surely he's not concerned with angels, but he is concerned with the descendants of Abraham." again, God is not just concerned with the descendants of Abraham in a little literal sense. This text is about salvation, and it's about all of us who inherit salvation. These are parallel thoughts, talking about angels and then talking about who, what it's about and with the people. The descendants of Abraham and those who are going to inherit salvation are the same people. They're all of us who believe. Says when speaking in the context of angels, he makes this point. This is kind of making my point. And of course, speaking of those who believe as descendants of Abraham, again, we see that elsewhere as well. Romans 4:16, Galatians 3:29. Not going to go into those texts. We're talking about Hebrews. All right. So next section. What are God's laws written on the heart? Oh, this one. So if you've heard a Torah observant person talk about the New Covenant, you've heard them go on about this part. Look, it's just the Torah written on the heart. So let's look at that in some detail. I think that there might be some stuff here that you haven't really heard or considered, and so I want to get into it. So I know I'm going to lose a lot of Torah folks here, because obviously I'm going to disagree. I'm going to argue that this is not referring to the exact same list of commandments given at Sinai in its totality. I do hope that you'll have the courage to deal with what's in the text and not just tune out because you don't like the conclusion. All right, I'm going to explain what I think is meant, and then I'm going to call out several terrible ways I've heard Torah folks of all kinds try to respond to the arguments that they haven't dealt with before. So don't be like those. All right, let's establish the context. First of all, there's several contexts we're actually dealing with in this text. Number one is Jeremiah's context. Jeremiah is the site where the citation is coming from. It's a prophecy. So his context matters. Also, because it's a predictive prophecy, we do also have to look at how the prophecy is fulfilled and interpreted in the New Testament. So we'll have to look there, and of course here at Hebrews for that full picture. And also it's important, there's an important difference found between the Hebrew and the Septuagint at this point. And we're going to look at that in some detail and why the author of Hebrews says what he says. Now, in Jeremiah's day, no one would argue that when someone refers to the law, they're referring to the commandments of God given through Moses from Sinai, and of course at the Jordan in Deuteronomy. There's no question or controversy about what's being referred to. When Jeremiah talks about the law, there's no question. He's talking about the law of Moses in its totality from both Sinai and from Deuteronomy. Now, I've argued elsewhere the Torah does distinguish between universal moral standards and that do apply to all nations, that don't just apply within this covenant, but there are also specific commandments that are specific to this covenant made at Sinai. I'm not saying just specific to a people, I'm saying specific to a covenant. And that's really what we're going to see here in Hebrews, but ultimately. But I'm not going to belabor that point. You can find that in another video. But I just point that out. So that's a context, Jeremiah's context, right? Jeremiah 31:33. Now we're going to look at the Septuagint stuff. So notice here from the Hebrew, this is what Jeremiah says. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now let's look at it in the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of this, present before Jesus' time. It says, "For this is my covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will surely put my laws into their mind, and write them on their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people." Notice the difference. In the original Hebrew, it's Torah, my Torah. It's singular. In the Greek Septuagint, it's plural, my laws. Now, does that matter? Back in Jeremiah's day, obviously the Septuagint wasn't around in Jeremiah's day, but in any time up to the time of Christ, would it matter, the singular or plural? No, not really. But I make the point here, I want you to look at that, because that's something that's going to be used by the author of Hebrews to great effect. Now, but I want to ask you this question, and I'm going to ask you in the chat to think about it. It says, before you think it's not significant, have you ever heard an argument that says every time this Greek or Hebrew word is used, it refers to whatever? I'm sure you've heard that statement made by either a pastor, or teacher, or apologist. Somebody has said every time this term is used, it always refers to something, right? You've heard it a million times. I've said it a million times. So you're about to hear another one of those. So I want you to pay close attention. You'll notice that in the Septuagint, Jeremiah 31:33 says law is plural, while the original Hebrew is singular. The author of Hebrews is clearly familiar with both the Hebrew and the Septuagint, and in fact, that Hegg makes a note of this. I don't know if I have that citation, but early on in his commentary, he makes note of the fact that at times the author cites, from the Hebrew text, and we can tell because there are differences, and we can tell he's quoting the Hebrew, and in other places we can tell he's quoting the Septuagint. So it's not always one or the other. So we know the author of Hebrews is familiar with both, and so that means when he cites one or the other, it's not an accident. He's doing it on purpose. At Hebrews 8:10, it's plural. So we know he's citing from the Septuagint the plural for the term, laws. Now, it's not a big deal necessarily until we look at the rest of the book of Hebrews. We're about to hear that argument I told you you're going to hear. The word nomos in its various forms appears in the singular 12 times in Hebrews, and every single time it is set in contrast with something related to Christ. It is set against or different from something related to Christ. Every time, every single time, law, nomos, appears in a singular form, it is contrasted with Christ. Here, I put a couple of examples here. For the law made nothing perfect. Of course, Jesus does make us perfect. And then it talks about in chapter 7 a change of the law. For when there's a change in the priesthood, there's also a change in the law. So a change in the law away from one thing to something about Christ. So every time, every single time, let me say it one more time, every time that the word law appears singular, it is a contrast. You can look it up. It's a contrast with something about Christ. That doesn't mean necessarily it's like bad or anything like that, but it's set in contrast to Christ every single time. When it's singular, it appears plural. Nomos is how it looks. It appears plural only 2 times in the book of Hebrews. Both times are citation of this same verse. So it appears first here in chapter 8. Later, it appears again when the author of Hebrews a second time cites the Jeremiah passage. And that time it's also plural. So the only time it ever appears plural is when he's citing Jeremiah in citing specifically the Septuagint version of the Jeremiah prophecy. Now, if he wanted to, if the author of Hebrews had wanted to, he could have cited the Hebrew version and cited the singular. Now, as I mentioned before, Tim Hegg makes frequent reference to whether a citation comes from Hebrew or the Greek. And so we know that's also going on. As I mentioned, Hegg is also aware that the author of Hebrews knows of these 2 ways that, he's got the original Hebrew, he's got the Greek translation. He sometimes uses one, sometimes uses the other. So Hegg is also aware of that fact. So why cite the plural? Now, it seems clear to me, this is my argument, and take it for what it is. It seems clear that he's creating a distinction within the book of Hebrews between the term the law, which is always contrasted with Christ, and my laws, which is something written on the heart for the new covenant. See, my laws isn't contrasted with Christ. It's a feature of the new covenant. My laws are written on their hearts, right? That new covenant member has my laws, plural, written on their heart. Now, here's the thing. That's an interesting fact all by itself. But if we go back and look in the Torah, in the law, the 5 books of Moses, which by the time the author of Hebrews writing, the law also refers to those 5 books. We notice that this kind of thing happens where we just have laws appearing in the plural only once by itself in a whole book. This happens again. I should say Hebrews is where it's happening again. It happens in the Bible. Another biblical author who writes about the law, and he writes laws. He writes about the law singular a lot, and he also writes the word laws, but he puts it by itself in the plural one time in a book. Can you guess what author I'm talking about and what book I'm talking about? What book, and you can look this up and cheat, but what book of the Old Testament has the word laws in the plural by itself one time in the whole book? I know there's a little bit of a delay. I'll give you a second to try to guess. See who can get it. It's actually a favorite verse for Torah observant people to cite. They really like using it. Anybody have a guess? Pamphilus says Romans. No, it's Old Testament. It's Old Testament. We're thinking. All right. See if anybody can get it. Psalms? No. All right. Here it is. Genesis 26:5. In Genesis, it says, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. In the Hebrew, now this is in the original Hebrew. It's plural. It says Torot instead of Torah. And it is plural in Genesis 26:5. The book of Genesis has no singular references to Torah. No, none. It does not exist. And only this one reference to law, that word, and it is in the plural. And it's in the plural in the original. So again, this is important for our author of Hebrews because he's going to, if he's making a connection, which I do think he is, he's making a connection to something that everyone, no matter what, whether they read the Hebrew or the Greek, doesn't matter. They would see the plural. He's using a plural, and he can do so citing the Old Testament because Jeremiah's prophecy in the Septuagint is in the plural. So he's not like making up a plural. He's citing a translation that uses plural. It's not that, like I said before, it's not that impactful in Jeremiah by itself. It's just, throughout the Old Testament, there's lots of places, laws. Doesn't really matter. You can refer to the law as a singular whole. You can refer to laws as plural because there's lots of laws in there, right? There's lots of laws in the law. So most of the time, it's not a big deal. But it's very interesting that Moses, who writes a ton on the law, right? Writes down the laws, right? And he says the word law lots of times in his stuff, in Exodus and on. But I believe Moses is the author of Genesis, and Moses only writes Torah one time in Genesis, and it's plural. Why does Moses do this? I don't know. But it's something that would be well known to people who studied the law of Moses. And, they notice where words like this are used. And then our author of Hebrews, in his book, only uses the word laws, plural, in one way. It appears twice, but it's citing only one verse both times. So here's what I want to point out and why I think this is so important. This is a verse. This one in Genesis, is the one and only time any version of Torah appears in Genesis, which is the time before the Sinai Covenant. Before that covenant was made, which is the whole book of Genesis, we only have that word one time, but it's in the plural. And I think that what's going on here, I think it's pretty clear, is that the author of Hebrews is purposefully using the singular every time to refer back to the law found in the Sinai Covenant, the law that's connected to that covenant. But when he cites the New Covenant passage that does use the word law, he cites the plural. And the only other book that I know of in the Bible, or one book in the Bible that uses that plural all by itself, is back there in Genesis before there was a Sinai Covenant. So it's connecting, I believe what's going on is he's connecting his plural use to another plural use that is both found outside of the Sinai Covenant. In Genesis, it's outside the Sinai Covenant, and he's making the point here, the New Covenant, which is coming along to replace the Sinai Covenant, and he'll get into this, but he's when he cites the term for law, he goes with the Septuagint because now he can say it in the plural and contrast it with all the singulars that do refer to the Sinai Covenant. It's something, again, this is something we're getting by looking at the text of Hebrews on its own terms, like what Tim Hegg said he was doing. We're looking at how do these words get used in the text, because there's lots of ways the text of Scripture uses the term law that doesn't necessarily have to refer to the specific stuff in the Sinai Covenant. It can refer to commandments more generally, or specific commandments, things like that. So, and I think that there's some, so getting back in kind of into the slides, and stuff I just said is in these slides too, so we might kind of skip through, but nobody's more in a better position to speak on the law than Moses. Moses is the one through whom it was given, right? And when he uses the singular, he doesn't do it until God is beginning to work with his own generation in Exodus 12. Moses refrains from using that term when he's writing the whole book of Genesis. He only uses it once and in the plural in Genesis, and then we see the author of Hebrews pick up on that. By the time of Jesus, the term law, it's so important that it's often used as a label for all the scriptures. I think it's impossible that the readers of Hebrews wouldn't catch the difference between law and laws. Now, Torah observance folks, assiduously don't catch the difference. It's important not to notice the difference, because that way you can try to say that it's just the same law as given at Sinai. That's what it is. That's what it really is. But there's a difference there, and I haven't heard of any that make note of these things that are said, and how this does connect back to a time before the Sinai Covenant. And I don't think it would be unfamiliar to the readers of Hebrews, the original readers, that you have the way that the word law is used in Genesis versus later parts of the Torah, and then seeing that same difference here in the book of Hebrews. And remember, what did he say? The new covenant, or what did God say to Jeremiah? The new covenant is not like the Sinai Covenant. So all the descriptions now, of the new covenant found in the Jeremiah citation, they serve to highlight how it's not like the Sinai Covenant. So when we look at all those other descriptions, we'll go into those in a little more detail, but why would this one thing, that my laws, written on their heart, why would this be the one thing that's just exactly like the Sinai Covenant? All these other things are different, but this is the one thing that's totally exactly the same. Again, it's not, it doesn't follow the flow of what the text says. All right, so let's look at how, again, at how Tim Hegg looks at this verse, because he does note the singular and the plural. But let's see what he says about it. Again, from his commentary, I'm reading Hegg now. And I will write them on their hearts, the LXX, and thus our author as well. LXX stands for Septuagint. So back to Hegg. The Septuagint continues the plural with write them on their hearts, referring to the previous plural laws. The Hebrew of Jeremiah having the singular, my Torah, which follows with, and upon their heart I will write it. Thus, the whole Torah is envisioned here, not simply a part of it. This in itself should warn us away from the common teaching of the Christian church that the ceremonial and civil parts of the law have been abolished and only the moral aspects remain. In Jeremiah's new covenant, the Torah is considered, as everywhere in the Tanakh, as a singular whole that cannot be divided. This text from Hegg is a little, it can be a little confusing. The first time I read it, it sounded like he was saying the whole Torah is envisioned here, not simply a part of it, and he goes into this civil ceremonial stuff. I thought for a second he was saying that's why he, the author of Hebrews is using the plural. Because what I'm looking for here and why I was digging into this commentary was to say, well, how does Hegg deal with the fact that it's plural and not singular in Hebrews? Well, he doesn't. What's actually happening here, it took me a couple times reading it to see what he's saying, but he's not dealing with the plural. He's pointing out, yes, it's plural, but the original Hebrew was singular, and thus the whole Torah is envisioned because it was singular. And that's what he means there by that last statement. Torah is considered, as everywhere in the Tanakh, as a singular whole that cannot be divided. Now, this is really interesting because he's ostensibly giving us a commentary on the book of Hebrews, but the book of Hebrews doesn't use the singular. The book of Hebrews cites a passage that was originally in the singular. A translation changed it to plural, and he keeps the plural on purpose. So Hegg is here not explaining why Hebrews is keeping the plural, though he's making note of it. He's saying, yep, it's in the plural, but notice how the original was singular. Now I'm going to make a whole argument about the fact that it's singular. And that therefore, just because it's singular in the original, it can't be divided up. And of course, that's, he doesn't give us any real argument for that. It's just sort of what he offers as his opinion based on that. And this is what I note here. He never attempts to explain why Hebrews is opting for the plural. But he feels free to speculate on an interpretation that fits his theology, of course. He doesn't explain his position against the distinctions in the law. He's talking about ceremonial, civil. That's not explaining, away those things by just simply noting that something is singular. I mean, that argument, that doesn't follow. I mean, a thing can be, just because something can be divided into parts doesn't mean one can't refer to it as with a singular noun. There are lots of things we refer to as in a singular that you could still divide up into some parts of it are like this and some parts of it are like that. a singular car still has four wheels, so his argument just doesn't really make any sense. And he doesn't give us any argument for, it's not really an argument, it's a conclusion. He gives us a conclusion, oh, it's singular, therefore the Torah can't be divided. Well, there's no argument there. He doesn't offer one. So, and again, he strangely, very strangely, he just opts for not explaining, not commentating in his commentary on why the author of Hebrews went for the plural. Why, if it's all about the singular, and then why did he go with the plural? I've given you what I think is a very solid bit of reasoning for why I think the author of Hebrews went with the plural, because with the singular use, his singular use of nomos, and with other endings, but the singular use of law every single time, it's a contrast. It's a contrast between something about the law and something about Christ, because that's the whole book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is full of contrast between Christ and other things. Most of it has to do with the law and with things related to Moses, but not everything. But yeah, every time the singular is used, it's contrasting with Christ. So the only time it's plural is here in this text, when it's about the new covenant and about what Christ does. It makes sense to me that he would choose the other way of saying it that he had at his disposal, and that it ties back to the Torah, to that time outside of the Sinai Covenant, which fits hand in glove with what he's saying about Christ. So again, the interpretation needs to come from the text. Hegg didn't give us anything from the text. He gave us, well, the original Hebrew, which is not being cited here, says something, and here's what I think about that. And he'd rather talk about that, and he's not talking about Hebrews anymore. We will see that the interpretation that I'm giving here, links up with other ways the new covenant gets described in this citation, in this very text we're looking at. The plural distinguishes the laws written on the mind and heart with the law given through Moses. It links back to a time before the Sinai Covenant, with the singular plural reference in Genesis, showing that the laws in view for the new covenant are more like the general universal laws present in Genesis than the specific covenantal laws given at Sinai and the Jordan. This link is real. It's in the text. Hegg's suppositions are not found in the text. To attempt to get a fair hearing, let me name and dismiss okay, so I'm going to say some things at this point to try to appeal to Torah observant folks, to not fall prey to some bad arguments at this point. Because a lot of times, once I've made an argument, people like to dismiss them, not actually deal with them. So I'm going to deal with some bad arguments. That's preposterous. That's ridiculous. That's silly. Name calling isn't an argument. You can think what you want, but pardon me if I don't find ridicule convincing. If you are a Trinitarian, and many Torah observant folks are, and Tim Hegg is, you will find your position ridiculed in the same way by anti-Trinitarians. They all call the Trinity ridiculous and preposterous and all that. It's just as unconvincing when you do it as when they do it. And now if you aren't a Trinitarian, then you're just guilty of this fallacy more often than the Trinitarians are, because you use the same fallacy on Trinitarians. It's a fallacy whether you're consistent or inconsistent in using it. How about this? My favorite verse, Matthew 5:17, or some other verse that says in the Torah that uses the term olam or forever, that kind of stuff. My favorite verse proves my version of Torah observance, therefore you're wrong. Now, there's another argument that may come up in trying to deal with this, what I've said. Obviously, I don't interpret your favorite verses the same way you do. Your conclusions found in a completely different context are just as likely to be wrong as your conclusions in this context. If you can't deal with the immediate context, it casts doubt on your conclusions elsewhere. This is just the common thing that lots of people do. We've seen Hegg actually do it when he went back to Psalm 19 about, the law of the Lord is perfect. When someone doesn't like an argument that they're hearing in one text and they jump out of that context and go talk about an entirely different part of the Bible that says the things they feel more comfortable and they like better. If you're doing that, it shows that you can't deal with this context. And if you can't deal with this context, there's a good chance you could be wrong about that other one. So that's another fallacy. Let's not do that. My favorite teacher or scholar disagrees with you. Oh, and my answer to that is, okay, my favorite teacher or scholar disagrees with you. Now what? I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. When I make an argument and someone says, oh man, you just need to read so-and-so, or you need to listen to this scholar or this person. They'll really set you straight. Okay, I'm not, it's not that person probably isn't very smart. I'm sure they are. I think Tim Hegg is very smart. But it's just a way to avoid dealing with the text. If you just say, oh man, you just need to read so-and-so, that tells me, oh, so you think so-and-so has a good answer to this, but you're not willing to paraphrase it for us. Maybe, and I think there are a couple reasons that might be. Number one is so-and-so may not have a good answer for this. They just have said other things. It's kind of like going to a different text of scripture. They just have said other things that you find convincing. And you think that if I listen to them, I would find that other stuff convincing and that would make me change my mind here. But again, it's just distraction. It's not dealing with what we're actually dealing with, which is the text of scripture. If you were right, if your position was right about this text, then you would be able to answer what I give you about this text from this text. And if your favorite scholar or teacher can do it, then you would be able to at least tell us, well, so-and-so can say it better than I can, but he basically says blah, 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 blah. And you would be actually dealing with the text. I have no problem with citing scholars, but let's not just say, you need to read so-and-so, because I can just tell you the same thing. And we're back at the same spot. Another bad argument. You just believe that because you've been indoctrinated in centuries of tradition. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this one. Now, first of all, you don't know what I'm motivated by. You can't read my heart and mind. You don't know what motivates me to believe what I believe. I can tell you what motivates me. It's I believe God, and I believe his scriptures are true, and I read them and I trust them, and I believe I'm dealing with them honestly. That's what I'm motivated by, but you don't have to believe that. So I like this fallacy is C.S. Lewis called it bulverism. He coined the term bulverism. Obviously, the fallacy goes back to before him, but he pointed it out. It is really fascinating. It's a fallacy that you think if you can explain why someone believes something, then you've refuted them. Which, when you put it that way and you think about it, that's just nonsense. The example he uses, C.S. Lewis uses when he's explaining bulverism, he says, "You only say that because you're a man." Like it is very, very common in our culture. It's a distraction. It's a lazy distraction, because the thing is, you don't even have to be right about what you say. It's good enough for you in your mind, if you're using this bad argument, to say, well, you believe that because XYZ. First of all, you probably don't even know that XYZ is true. There's that. But to the person using this bad argument, this bad comeback, you don't even have to have studied me or what my motivations are to even know if that's true. For this to work in your mind, it's again, it's lazy, it's a distraction, it's not dealing with the actual text. So don't fall prey to it. So yeah, let's not do poor comebacks. Let's deal with the actual Bible. So Moving on, who knows God in this covenant? So this covenant talks about knowing God, right? They will all know God. The statement about God's laws written on the heart and mind is really just one way of describing a regenerate people, Christians, believers. The rest of the citation, the rest of the prophecy about the new covenant contains other ways of describing the same people. And they're all set in contrast with the covenant God made at Sinai. So it's not the laws written on the hearts, mentioning laws is mentioned in contrast to the Sinai covenant. It's not like that covenant made at Sinai. It's, because the laws will be written on your hearts. And it goes on to talk about other ways it's different. And this is another way it's different, is about who knows God in the covenant. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts, as opposed to just external laws being written on stone or papyrus. It says, I will be their God and they will be my people. As opposed to just being born into a nation where the nation has a God and they're in this covenant, by birth. They will all be his from within. So my words are bad on the slide, but basically, yeah, I'll be their God and they'll be my people. Was all of Israel his people? Not in this sense. God says this all the time in the Old Testament. One day in the future, I will be your God and you will be my people. So they're not his people, right? In some true sense, in some deeper sense than the fact that they were just born in Israel and they are part of this covenant that is for these people. So God is saying he will be their God in a new and special way. So it's, again, a contrast between that covenant. So now we come to verse 11, and it's really not at all complicated to understand, but it's often used to support some views of the new covenant that try to minimize its effect on life of believers today. So Hegg does this, but other people who believe in Torah observance do this, and they do it. Some do it in different ways, but oftentimes this verse 11, which talks about they will all know me, that's this verse is often used to make that change, make that argument. So the verse says, they shall not teach everyone his fellow citizen and everyone his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all will know me, from the least to the greatest of them. So what does this text mean by no more need to teach? Let's take a look again at Hegg's commentary. So let's see what Hegg says about this. What does Tim Hegg say about needing to know the Lord? Okay. This is again from his commentary, quoting Hegg. The next characteristic of the new covenant describes how Israel's loyalty to the Lord will be universal. The word know in the Hebrew context often connotes intimate relations, and in a covenant context, faithful relations. Here, in a specific new covenant context, the idea of knowing the Lord as loyalty to the covenant is cast in the picture of a husband and a wife. The new covenant made with Israel will bring her into the true and intimate relation with God that he has always desired and promised. But notice, this is once again corporate in scope. The nation as a whole is brought to her God in truth. So for brevity, I left out Hegg's citation of Hosea that spoke of knowing God in the way he describes here. So he's talking about knowing God as this loyalty, this special, faithful relationship to God. And I don't really have an argument with that. That part of Hegg's point is fine. What he leaves out of is a discussion of what it means that no one needs to teach his neighbor to know the Lord in the new covenant, except to simply say Israel's loyalty will be universal. Hegg has taught elsewhere that he believes that these statements about the new covenant in verse 11 are yet to come to pass, So he thinks that they're not present for us today and will in the future when the physical people and nation of Israel have repented and turned to Christ. So when he's talking about this loyalty being universal, he means it on a national level for Israel, that Israel will be a people that all, basically turn to Christ. And that's what this means when it says that no one will need to teach each other to know the Lord. This is also from his commentary. This is where he's making the case for that. And I do want you to listen closely to this part if you've been kind of tuning out. This is Hegg making the case that everyone, they will all know me, is national in scope. It says, however, when we consider the larger context of Jeremiah's prophecy and then consider the immediate context of the New Covenant prophecy, the characteristic of new seems highly appropriate, for Jeremiah is speaking in reference to the whole nation, not to a remnant part. If one considers this prophecy as having a national scope, then such a phenomenon is in fact new. For never in Israel's history do we see the nation as a whole fully demonstrating faithfulness to God and his righteous ways. Yet, as we continue to see Jeremiah's prophecy unfolded, we marvel at the superlative and comprehensive characteristics of the entire nation as having unequivocal covenant allegiance to the God who has redeemed them. All right. So Hegg's full treatment of the New Covenant, it really is complicated and difficult, and I'm not going to try to address everything there about it here. But I do want to point out that his position on this prophecy is that it is a description of the physical people of Israel out in the future when they've all repented. He also does believe that Christians today are also members of the New Covenant, but he takes this prophecy to be a reference to a future salvation of the nation of Israel. Hegg's argument for the national nature of the prophecy is sadly not robust. You just heard it. Note the highlighted text in the previous citation. If one considers this prophecy as having a national scope, then such a phenomenon is in fact new. Hegg does not make any further case for this being national in his commentary. But later we do have this. Oh, and so first, I just want to make sure this part is not missed. We just read the part where Hegg argues that the scope of the New Covenant is national. The traditional Christian understanding of the New Covenant is that it is not national. It is global in terms of faith, in terms of all the people who believe come into the New Covenant that Jesus inaugurated with his blood, as we read in Luke. So that is the traditional, and remember, what did Hegg say at the beginning? He's going to deal with these arguments from the traditional Christian view. He doesn't deal with the traditional Christian view that the New Covenant is not national in scope. He has a whole section in the commentary, not in this particular chapter, but another place, where he just kind of describes what he believes about the Old and New Covenant. Nowhere in that section does he make a case for why it's national and not like spiritual or related to faith or whatever that Christians have generally believed. He just doesn't make a case for it. So when he comes here, you're reading his case for it being national, and his whole case is if one considers. That's what I read. Now, maybe I missed something. I read all these sections very carefully. It's certainly possible I could be wrong, but this is the entire case I could find for seeing the New Covenant as national. Is just that, well, if we think of it as national, there's definitely something new about that. That's the whole argument. Now let's read what he says later in the commentary about this subject. It says, the New Covenant, as we have studied, promises a revival of national proportions, the like of which Israel has never known. The Levitical priesthood, even in its finest hour, which certainly was not during the first century, could never have hoped to effect such a national revival. So here, later in the commentary, he confidently says, as we have studied, the New Covenant promises a revival of national proportions. No, we haven't studied that. Hegg has supposed that, has considered that as a possibility. Now he's stating it as a certainty, but there's been no argument for it up to this point. All right. So, so from saying if we consider, that doesn't equate to as we've studied. But he behaves as if he's made his case, and he just hasn't made a case. And this is something that's actually pretty common, as we've seen a bit of throughout the commentaries, that he has a way he wants to see it. He states that, and then that is just considered the way it is. But oftentimes he doesn't really make a case for his position. All right. The simple answer to all the questions about what these descriptions mean is that they refer to people who are saved by Christ. Allow me to demonstrate. The New Covenant is not like the Sinai Covenant that was broken by the people. God promised this covenant because he found fault with the people under the previous covenant. So we're going to hear about how this new covenant is different, and it has to do with solving the problem of finding fault in the first covenant. How does God solve the fault in them? As you know, and I put that in quotes because that's what the text says. Or finding fault with them, I think is what it actually says. But how does God solve this fault? His laws are written on mind and heart. So what God requires of us, because he still does require things of us, we still must obey God. But what we have to obey, he writes on our hearts. How does he do that? He's given us the spirit of truth, to lead us into all truth. So he's written it on our hearts. He's made us a new creation. There's a lot of different ways the New Testament describes this. But his laws are written on the mind and heart. So what he wants of us is written on our minds and hearts. That's different from, the law written on stone and papyrus back, during Moses. And it's different laws too, if we really consider the singular plural stuff we saw earlier. So the laws are written on hearts and minds. That's one way the new covenant's different. Another way the new covenant's different. He will be their God and they will be his people. It's no longer, as Hegg says, and I think he's right, it's no longer about just a remnant of the people in the covenant actually being his people. No, now we will be his God and we will be his people. He will be our God. They will not need to teach each other to know God because they will all know him. Notice that that's what the text says. It doesn't say they'll no longer need to teach each other anything about God. That's not what it says. It says they no longer need to teach each other saying, know the Lord. Because under the Sinai Covenant, they did. The priests and prophets had to teach the people who were under that covenant to know God because they didn't all know God, even though they were part of his covenant. This new covenant's different. Now everyone in this covenant knows God. And then it says, the last part, God will be merciful and no longer remember their sins. So under the new covenant, God forgives sins. Again, that's true of all the people in the new covenant. It's not true of all the people in the old covenant. And really even under that Sinai covenant, it's the the sacrifices for sins, all that stuff. It's all temporal. It's not in an eternal sense. He's not really being merciful and no longer remembering their sins. It's that they're getting this covering that I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically it's not doing what this new covenant does. So all of these are ways in which the new covenant is not like the covenant made at Sinai. They all four describe these differences. Now, so some pushback. Again, I just point this out. A lot of people lean on this. They will no longer need a teacher to teach them to know the Lord. They try to universalize that statement to everything, and therefore say, therefore we're not in the new covenant. But that's not what the text says. It says to know the Lord. Every Christian knows the Lord. Every member of the new covenant is a Christian who knows the Lord. Therefore, as Christians, we don't need to teach each other, one another within the faith, to know the Lord. Now, we still talk about it. We still teach each other things about the Lord, and we still remind each other things. But as far as actually knowing the Lord, everyone in this new covenant already knows the Lord. And that's different from the Sinai Covenant. A big difference. And so, again, that's almost always what they use to try to push some other way of looking at it. But really, just when you look at the text and see what it says, you realize that's, and I've never heard anyone proposing a different way of looking at the new covenant like Hegg does, like other Torah observant people do. I've never heard any of them address that point, address that, they all present their theory about what not needing a teacher means, but none of them have ever addressed the actual text that it's about a specific thing, and that maybe we don't need this to be pushed way out into the future. Maybe this is just true of all Christians today who are part of the body of Christ. All right. So, moving on, what is obsolete and growing old? So this is coming now out of the citation into verse 13, where our author of Hebrews picks it back up. And this is the divinely inspired interpretation of that new covenant prophecy. So we've just looked in detail at the new covenant prophecy. What does the interpreter, the author of Hebrews, have to say about that new covenant prophecy? It says, when he said a new covenant, and again, this is inserted, covenant is inserted in this text. So I just want to make that point, and we'll discuss it in detail. But when he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is about to disappear. As with verse 7, covenant is often inserted, but not always. There are translations that don't insert it. Here's some examples. The Lexham English Bible says, in calling it new, he has declared the former to be old. Now, what is becoming obsolete and growing old is near to disappearing. And Young's literal translation says, in the saying new, he hath made the first old. And what doth become obsolete and old is nigh disappearing. So we see here's a couple of translations that don't insert covenant in there. Now, remember, what is it that's been called new? The new covenant. That's the only thing. But so most of them do insert it. But I just want that to be out there. I'm not saying the word is there. It's not. But is it, just like with verse 7, is it a legitimate thing to put that in there? Now, some Torah teachers, they do try to make this new thing refer to Jesus' priesthood. Again, try to get it back to the priesthood as opposed to the old Levitical priesthood. When verse 13 refers to God calling something new, it is clearly calling back to the beginning of what the author just cited, which is clearly and unambiguously about the new covenant. It's the only thing that's been called new at this point in the text. There just aren't any other options while staying within the context. Remember, we just, in verse 8, or verse 7, actually, it says in calling, it says, for finding fault with them, he says, I establish, I effect a new covenant, right? So it says new covenant, and the word covenant is there. It's the only time anything's been called new in the book of Hebrews. And now in verse 13, it's saying, in calling it new, he declared the first obsolete. Well, what did he call new? The only thing he called new was the covenant. So there's no question about that, especially when we look at it. Just look at the context. So according to the author of Hebrews, but notice, so he says, because God calls the new covenant new, this entails, according to the author of Hebrews, that the first is old and obsolete. And what is old and obsolete is near to passing away or disappearing. What is the first? Well, quite clearly, it's the first covenant, the one made at Sinai. That is explicitly what is compared within the Jeremiah citation. What does Jeremiah compare? The new covenant with the one made at Sinai, with the Sinai covenant. That's what's compared, contrasted really, within the Jeremiah citation. And so now we're hearing how the author of Hebrews just is interpreting that. And we've shown the first one in verse 7 is, we've shown what it's referring to. It's referring to the covenant. This fits the language of the following chapter, which explicitly says first covenant. So we talked about that a little bit. Chapter 9, verse 15 actually says first covenant. So what does declare to be old or become obsolete mean? The Greek palaiao, I'm not good at the pronunciation, appears 4 times in the Bible. This is the term for old or declare to be old. 3 of them are in Hebrews. 2 of them are right here in this verse. So half of all the times they appear in the Bible. They will become old like a garment is in Luke 12:33, and also make yourselves money belts which will not wear out or become old. Hebrews 1:11, they will become old like a garment. That's from Hebrews as well. And then the Luke one is make money belts which will not wear out. So what does growing old mean? Greek gerosko appears twice here and in John 21:18, but when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands. So we're using these terms, become old, become obsolete, wear out. These are the terms being used, again, about the first covenant. Now, clearly, both terms refer to things coming to the end of their life. Notice that they do not refer to being overridden or overthrown. This is a common thing when you're listening to Torah observance folks talk about the law, is that it's about, Jesus didn't come to destroy or abolish the law. Well, the language of Scripture when it's talking about the Sinai Covenant is that it is growing old and becoming obsolete. It's just wearing out is a way it's described. So this is language that is used of something that has a limited lifespan, and that time is coming to an end. That's the language we have here. The author concludes that when something comes to this point, it is close to vanishing or disappearing. So we're, according to the text, that is what's happening to the Sinai Covenant. What does vanishing or disappearing mean? The Greek aphanismos means to disappear. It only appears here in this one text in Scripture. That which grows old soon disappears. This is how the first covenant is described due to the coming of the new covenant. This perfectly describes what happened historically, since there is one generation, 40 years, between the resurrection and the destruction of the temple and the whole Sinai covenant system with it. So the author of Hebrews, who's writing before the destruction of the temple, Hegg disagrees with that. He thinks it's after. I'm not going to go over all that. He doesn't have very good arguments for that either. But most scholars, and I agree, believe that Hebrews was written before the destruction of the temple. For many reasons. His language about things still going on in the temple is one reason, and another reason is that he's busy talking about all these contrasts between how Christ is superior to things like, within the old covenant. If the temple weren't there, that would be a huge one to mention. But it, since it hadn't happened yet, it isn't mentioned. But the point I'm, in this text is it fits hand in glove with that idea that this is written before the destruction of the temple, because he uses this sort of present participle language. That which is growing old, is getting ready to disappear. It is near to vanishing. That's language about something that the author of Hebrews is saying, it's about to be gone. It's not gone yet. It's still visible, but it's not gone yet. And that is exactly what happened with all of the priesthood stuff and the temple stuff that he talks about in the book. So very cool stuff. So how does our Torah scholar, Tim Hegg, handle this text? How does he handle 8:13? Ask yourself as we read if Hegg is doing what he promised in the opening of the commentary, to allow the text of Hebrews to speak on its own terms. That's what Hegg said he's doing in this commentary. Let's read what he says about 8:13 and ask, is that what he's doing here? Starting with Hegg. Thus, those many English translations which include the word covenant in this verse do so as a matter of interpretation by the translators, not as based upon anything in the Greek text itself. But I would agree that the word new in this verse is pointing back to its use in the New Covenant texts just quoted from Jeremiah, and thus the addition of the word covenant with the word new by English translators gives the proper sense. So what Hegg's referring to at the beginning of the quote is a list of translations that I didn't cite for you. I mean, he lists a whole bunch of translations that do insert the word covenant. And as you can see, though he wants to chastise them, he wants to tell them, oh, it's a matter of interpretation, not from the text, that they insert the word covenant. He cannot deny that in calling it new must refer to the new covenant. So he can't deny that. He says that when they put the word covenant in there, though they're doing it based on interpretation, they're giving the proper sense. He agrees that in calling it new is referring to the new covenant. Acknowledging this, that the new thing is a new covenant, now how does he deal with the first thing, growing old and disappearing, that comes after it? Let's see what he does with that. Once again, reading Hegg. But this leaves us with an obvious question. Why did the author of Hebrews not include the word covenant, if by using the word new, that is what he intended? The answer to this question, it seems to me, is that he did not want his readers to think that he was making a contrast between covenants, between the new covenant and the first covenant. So hear that. Hegg thinks the reason for the missing word covenant in this text is that he thinks the author does not want us to contrast the first, an old covenant or a first covenant with the new covenant. That's why he left the word covenant out. Now, if you're wondering if you read it right, if we read that right, you did. So he's denying that the first thing that's being made obsolete and growing old and disappearing, he's denying that's the first covenant. He doesn't think that's what that is. And we'll read on to see what he thinks is going on, but I just pause to note, he thinks the reason covenant isn't there is so that we'll compare the new covenant with something else other than the first covenant or the one made at Sinai. Now, as he's done before, he's not given any argument or support from the text. He didn't tell us anything from the text just now. He just said the word's missing, and I think it's, he's telling us what he thinks the author was thinking, but he didn't give us anything from the actual text to support what he said. Now, let's look what Hegg thinks is really happening. This is just continuing with the citation. Reading Hegg again. But this is precisely how the English translations have understood our verse. They conclude that our author is comparing the Sinai Covenant with the New Covenant, and that the Sinai Covenant is that which our author considers as old, having outlived its usefulness, and in his own day was about to be finished or rendered obsolete. But a number of issues speak against such an interpretation. First and foremost is the idea that the Sinai Covenant could be rendered old and obsolete when it was given as an eternal covenant to Israel. Indeed, the Sabbath is designated as the sign of the Sinai Covenant, and it is clearly noted to be eternal. Now he's quoting Exodus 31. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever, for in 6 days the Adonai made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed. Exodus 31, 16 through 17. Now, I've answered this assumptive, simplistic way of interpreting the Hebrew term olam as eternal as in an absolute sense before. So he quotes the text from Exodus. It says forever. It says perpetual, that kind of stuff. I've got lots of videos that address that. So go look for something on forever and you'll find it. If you really just can't find it, send me a message. I'll get you to it. But I've addressed that before. It's not a good argument. It's an assumptive argument to say that this Old Testament text is interpreting, that it means that the covenant is forever and ever and will never, come to any end in any sort of way. What I want to point out here, in light of that, is again what it goes back to a fallacy. Remember, I said if there's these bad comebacks. I gave a list of some bad comebacks because I give that list because I've heard those comebacks. When someone says something and someone doesn't like it, I've heard them all. This is one of them. This is my favorite Bible verse says this, therefore it can't mean what others have, the text we're looking at can't mean what others have said. But again, you could be wrong about your other favorite Bible verse too. and I think Hegg is. But I point out here that he is, he's using this sort of bad argumentation around the word forever, and that is disappointing. You would think that he's got something to back that up, but he doesn't. He really doesn't. But why did he have to go jump back to Exodus in the first place? Because this text isn't about what Exodus 31's about. This text is describing the relationship of the new covenant to the first something, and he thinks it can't be the first covenant, because of his interpretation of another text about that covenant. But that text isn't about the relationship of the two covenants. It's just about the Sabbath. So, and being a sign of that covenant, which is a whole argument in itself. It establishes some things that I don't think he likes as well. But that's getting far afield. Let's keep it, close to Hebrews here. So his first and foremost move. So first and foremost, he says, is to jump out of Hebrews and talk about Exodus. So there's that, of course. Then he does not show how Hebrews, again, we're holding him to his own words. Hebrews on its own terms clearly affirms his position on the new covenant. He's again calling in reinforcements from somewhere else in the Bible to try to shore up his position, because he can't do it right here in this text. A good student of the text should be seeking to understand how both passages are true, not marshaling one text to head off a very reasonable interpretation of another text. You don't do that. What is the very reasonable and way to look at this text that makes perfect sense and everything just kind of fits together? He doesn't try to do that. His appeal to the forever text is, again, it's really shaky. I've dealt with that issue before. But this isn't his only move. It's not the only thing he does here in this text. So let's read a little bit more of Hegg as he continues talking about verse 13. He says, "But more importantly, we have already seen that the primary subject addressed by our author in this context is not covenant, but priesthood, and specifically the superiority of Yeshua as high priest after the order of Melchizedek when compared to the earthly Levitical priesthood." So he's going back to the priesthood stuff, and we've seen that that's the primary subject being addressed. So what's going on? So without really any reason to do so, anything found in the text, he's again bringing up priesthoods. Priesthood hasn't been mentioned in Hebrews at this point since 8:6. That's when it was last mentioned, and it was spoken of as being based on something more fundamental, the better and new covenant. Now, since that point, everything has been about the new covenant. Everything we've read in that Jeremiah passage, we saw that in detail. But now Hegg is just bringing up the priesthood again. Nothing from the text to do so, but he's bringing it up again. And he gets to talking about what's growing old and disappearing. He spends several pages at this point, and I'm not citing everything, but he's arguing for why it couldn't possibly be the first covenant. He argues this based again on his appeal to forever passages. So that's all he's doing. He's just saying, it couldn't be that the new covenant, that the Sinai Covenant, first covenant, that's what's being referred to as growing old and disappearing because of all his favorite ways of interpreting the Old Testament passages. He also employs an argument about the immediate nature of the new covenant. And I'll address this one in a moment. But I do want to first get you to what Hegg actually thinks is being referred to. If it's not the first covenant, what is it? What is it that's growing old and disappearing? Here's the citation. Reading Tim Hegg again. To what then is our author referring when he writes that the first is becoming obsolete and growing old and is thus ready to disappear? Remembering that the main subject of our immediate context is the superiority of Yeshua's heavenly priesthood as over against Levitical priests, and given the fact that our author purposely does not include the word covenant in our verse, what seems to be the obvious referent is that of the Levitical priesthood. This is what was becoming obsolete, growing old, and ready to disappear. End of the citation. So, unsurprisingly, he's talking about the Levitical priesthood. That's what he thinks is the first thing that's growing old in verse 13. And you might expect at this point for Hegg to offer us an explanation of this conclusion. Oh, really? You think that that's what's growing old? Can you explain what that means? Please explain it. Maybe he'd give us sort of an interpolated rendering of the verse. So like restate the verse as, making it clear, making your interpretation clear. But he doesn't do any of that. He doesn't give us a different way of saying the verse to make the interpretation clear. He doesn't explain what he means by the Levitical priesthood growing obsolete and all of that. Instead, he raises the question of how this squares with his position that Hebrews is actually, against most scholarship, a later book written after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. This is something he postulated near the beginning of the commentary, where he seeks to defend it, but it's completely irrelevant to what we want to know, which is how he truly understands verse 13. This is just what he goes to next in the commentary, is how this kind of is supposed to relate to why he thinks this book was written after AD 70. So, but does he come back to it? No, he does not come back. This is the end of volume 1 of the commentary, the end of chapter 8. And after that last quote that I just gave you, nothing else is said about this interpretation of 8:13. 8:13, you recall, I'm going to go back a bit to just so we got it on the screen, the actual verse. Remember what we're talking about. We're talking about this verse. And I apologize, this verse. And this is a citation without the word covenant. In calling it new, he has declared the former to be old. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is near to disappearing. Hegg has acknowledged, and I think it's folly to say anything else, that what is new is the new covenant, because that's the only thing called new in the immediate context. He's acknowledged that. But he's saying, in calling the new covenant new, I'm going to go and do the interpolation so you can hear it with your ears. In calling it a new covenant, in calling the covenant new, he has declared the former priesthood to be old. Now, what is becoming old and obsolete and growing old is near to disappearing. The priesthood. In calling it new, the first priesthood became old. Do you understand what's going on here? Hegg is arguing that yes, it's a new covenant, but it's not being compared to another covenant. It's just being compared to the priesthood part of that covenant. That's a problem. Usually you don't compare things that are nothing alike. I put it in the slide. I didn't see that. Didn't have to go back. Anyway, yeah, he thinks that the first priesthood is obsolete, and that's what's being compared. There are many problems here, but he doesn't give us any further explanation. So he's going to answer none of the problems that I'm about to bring up, but they're problems inherent in what he just said. The last time priesthood was mentioned here's first problem. The last time priesthood was mentioned was back in verse 6, before the very detailed and long description of covenants, and actually contrasting two covenants within the Jeremiah passage. That stuff all happened since the last time priesthood was mentioned. But Hegg thinks that priesthood is the thing that the author of Hebrews is getting at without actually mentioning it. Sheer distance alone in the text is a good reason to doubt what he's saying here. The author is interpreting the Jeremiah citation itself, and Hegg admits that, but notice the author says in calling it new, he declares the first to be obsolete. The author is pointing out that God, within the Jeremiah prophecy, is declaring the first obsolete when the new comes. Jeremiah doesn't mention the priesthood. He's not declaring anything about the priesthood, and neither is the author of Hebrews. God does, however, in the prophecy, contrast the new covenant with the Sinai Covenant. The Hebrews is interpreting the words actually present in the prophecy, which are contrasting covenants. He's declaring the first covenant to be obsolete. While one can coherently state, there's another issue with Hegg again, while one can coherently state the new covenant could just make part of the first obsolete, it has to be explicit in order to make sense. So when you're just using a pronoun like this, just that first one, as here in the text, it is comparing apples to oranges to say the new covenant made the first obsolete, but actually not mean the other covenant mentioned in the text, but rather just the priesthood part of that covenant. If you don't make that part explicit, there's nothing to attach the non-explicit language to. That first what, that's not specific, but there's nothing specific to attach it to other than a covenant. So it's again, it doesn't make any sense. Hegg also doesn't deal with the implications. So his interpretation, this is where an explanation would be very helpful, because it isn't just that he seems wrong about what he's saying about the text, but there are also implications if he's right. He doesn't actually believe the Levitical priesthood is obsolete. Hegg's position on the sacrifices in the priesthood are just that they're on pause right now, and they will be restored in the millennial reign of Christ at some point in the future, as he interprets eschatology. And he thinks that the two priesthoods can operate alongside one another, with animal sacrifices being offered by Levitical priests and Christ just exercising his current priesthood based on his own sacrifice, that those things can just coexist just fine. And he gives an explanation for why that is. Does not compute with saying that the Levitical priesthood is obsolete and disappearing. If that's what the text is about, as he says it is, now it's contradicting other things that he believes or says he believes. So it renders, and another problem, it renders part of the Torah obsolete, because it's not the covenant part. It's not the part where there's a covenant made at Sinai. It's the priesthood part, but it's still part of the Torah. It's still commandments. It's still things there that the Bible's saying these are obsolete, and that's just as bad as what he is supposedly arguing against traditional Christian views of the law. And he doesn't explain how that can be under his own his own position. Some Torah observers do think that the law sacrifices are actually done and complete in Christ, will never be reinstated. They're no longer a valid way to worship God. Some people in the Torah observance and Hebrew roots sort of groups and communities, they do believe that. They think that we should still be doing like the kosher stuff and do stuff with the festivals, but the sacrificial stuff, Jesus took care of all of that. There are people in that camp. Hegg is not in that camp. So he's if he were in that camp, maybe his interpretation would at least be somewhat self-consistent. But as it is, I don't see how he holds that the priesthood is still valid and also obsolete, and say that that's what obsolete refers to. If it's because however you look at it, if he says, oh, it's obsolete in this weird sense that I'm going to define, which he doesn't do in his commentary, but maybe he does somewhere else, and he says that, oh, it's obsolete in some sense, maybe a temporary sense, and it's going to be brought back, in this kingdom, and that's all it means. But if that's the case, then you could say the same, about the covenant, and it would contradict his views. But you see how his view doesn't get it. His arguments don't actually get him to his conclusions. He doesn't really offer arguments. He offers conclusions only. And really this interpretation doesn't mean that, oh yeah, that's a good reason to say that it is just about the priesthood here in verse 13. It doesn't really give us a good reason to say that. All right, moving on. He's in a dilemma, and not just about whether sacrifices continue. His dilemma is with the language of 8:13, that the first is obsolete and near to disappearing. If he takes that in a strong sense, then he holds that part of the Torah is not really forever and passed away. And sacrifices and things like that sometimes use that word, Hebrew word olam, and forever. But he's now saying, oh, those things have passed away. And that completely destroys any arguments he's making based on the word forever, because he's holding some things aren't. But if he does take a weaker sense, that's just out of the world temporarily on pause, then he can't object if someone were to say the same thing about the Sinai Covenant. So that's just what I said a second ago. Ultimately, it ends up being special pleading, not something drawn from the text. Special pleading is a fallacy of just saying, basically, yeah, I know that the rules go a certain way. The rules of interpretation should be followed in XYZ way. But this is mine is a special case in which what I'm saying here is really the way we should go, but not really giving any good reason why. And that's really what's going on. Now, let's look at his only, I told you we get back to this argument. He does give a contextual argument against the use of the word covenant in verse 13. He argues that the coming of the new covenant is immediate, and therefore the language about being close to disappearing and becoming old, which are sort of process type language, just doesn't fit talking about the Sinai Covenant. So, citing Tim Hegg now. But the problem the final phrase of verse 13 presents to this interpretation is that elsewhere in the apostolic scriptures, the finality of the work accomplished by Yeshua through his death and resurrection is immediate and conclusive, not progressive and tentative. For instance, our sin is said to be nailed to the cross. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Colossians 2:13-15. End of my citation. So and this is another citation. I think it's from the... it's just continuing to cite Tim Hegg. Okay, continuing to read. Even in Hebrews, our author speaks in a similar way. And not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, he entered the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Thus, if our author intended to teach us that the Sinai Covenant was rendered inoperative by the priestly work of Yeshua in his death and resurrection, then he would not have portrayed the first covenant as becoming obsolete and ready to disappear. Granted, some commentators consider these words to describe the outward appearance of the Old Covenant, but that is not the issue about which our author is concerned. All right, end of that section. So I have no argument at all with the fact that the coming of the new covenant was sudden, that Jesus' sacrifice was once for all, and that everything was accomplished and finished with Christ. Hegg is simply wrong that this necessitates the sudden removal of the Sinai Covenant from the world at the moment of Jesus' death or resurrection. In fact, the removal was sudden in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple, as Jesus promised, but there was a 40-year overlap, one generation before that event. First, Hegg's argument doesn't follow. It is not necessary according to Scripture that the suddenness of the coming of the new covenant be accompanied by the sudden disappearance at the same time of the first covenant. No Scripture teaches it. Logic does not demand it. So, this is just pointing out, yes, there's language about suddenness related to the new covenant. It doesn't necessitate what Tim Hegg is arguing in regards to the Mosaic covenant. It's one of those things where, yes, you can see the Scripture describing two different things: the sudden new coming of the new covenant, the ready to disappear, growing old of the first covenant, if and that's what he's critiquing here. Those are the things we have. Our job as interpreters is to interpret why is that the case. And what Hegg is doing is saying, well, it's sudden, therefore this can't be talking about the Sinai Covenant because it's not sudden, and therefore it's got to be about something else. But the logical connection he's trying to make isn't there in the text. There's no text that says, and with the coming of the new covenant, the Sinai Covenant will disappear quickly, right away. It just doesn't. That connection he's trying to draw just isn't there. This is a good example of something in logic that's it goes by different names, but and I won't bore you with the Latin and all that stuff, but basically, if you have an if-then statement, you can. There's two ways of affirming an if-then statement, and therefore two conclusions you can come to. So a good example, if I read the book, then I know its contents. That's a statement. Now you can believe that's true, but then come to differing conclusions based on what else you believe about that. So you can say one argument you can make is, if I read the book, then I know its contents. And you believe I do read the book, therefore the conclusion, I know its contents. But you can also say, I don't know its contents, therefore I didn't read the book, right? And in a lot of cases when people are talking about high and lofty sort of concepts, like what we're talking about here, theology and philosophy and other things, two people might both agree about the truth of the if-then statement, but one person affirms the first part, the if part, and therefore concludes that the then part, the second part, is true, whereas another person denies the truth of the then part and therefore denies the first part. what we have here with Tim Hegg is something related to that, where he's made an argument that, an if-then argument. If the new covenant is sudden, then if the coming of the new covenant is sudden, then the disappearing of the old covenant is sudden. But the disappearing of the old covenant is not sudden. Therefore, well, he doesn't believe it's disappeared at all. So he's doing something a little bit different, but it's related to this conditional. He's basically saying, since that there's no disappearing of the covenant, therefore this conditional is false. And that's the third thing you can do with it, is say, well, these things don't relate that way, and therefore the conditional statement is false. But the problem is, the conditional statement is just not there. It's not something that he's argued for. And so it's missing from there's no support for making that conditional claim in order to refute the connection. But anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. But the point is, he has not made his case that the suddenness of the new covenant entails the sudden disappearing of the old covenant, if that's what's under view in this text. Second, his defense against some commentators' argument that the outward appearance is what is meant here, and that's not the issue, is demonstrably false. So he's saying, some commentators point out that it's what's growing old, what's disappearing is just sort of the outward appearance of the Sinai Covenant. And Hegg says, well, that's just not what the author's talking about. Well, that's demonstrably false. Hebrews is mostly concerned with the outward appearance of the Mosaic Covenant. That's how it's always described. Hebrews 9, 9b, so second part of 9:9 and into verse 10, says, accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. Notice that this text is all about the outward appearance. It's all about what's happening in the outward world, but it doesn't make you perfect. That's kind of the point of Hebrews. The regulations are not for the conscience, the inner, but for the body, the outer. In fact, the entire book of Hebrews characterizes everything about the priesthood and the first covenant as outer things. They don't make a man perfect. They're just physical shadows of spiritual realities. So to speak of the physical aspects of the first covenant as disappearing is just to speak of the covenant itself disappearing. That's all that the author of Hebrews has really said about that covenant. We've also addressed we've now addressed everything Hegg has to say in his commentary on chapter 8 pertaining to whether the new covenant is being contrasted with the old. I stated earlier that Hegg is the best when it comes to Torah observant scholarship. And as we've seen, it's pretty weak. So just to conclude with the only contextual argument he made had to do with this suddenness thing. But really, when it comes down to it, the outward appearance of the Sinai Covenant, that stuff taking a little while to go away. First of all, it did go away quickly in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. But secondly, everything about that covenant is outer. And so it really supports more those other commentators than anything Hegg has said. And again, he didn't argue for it. He didn't give us any good reasons. He just sort of stated that. All right. So conclusions, coming down to the end here. Hebrews 8:7 really does find fault with the first covenant, namely the one God made at Sinai, but that fault is with the faulty people in it, not the commandments. It's not saying commandments are faulty. It's saying the people in the covenant were faulty. So it is really about the covenant, and really did find fault in that covenant with the people. The fault in the people is why the new covenant is promised, because by the blood of Christ, the people are no longer faulty. Thus, the people no longer being faulty, have God's laws written on their hearts. That is, we are all given the Spirit and we're a new creation, and we desire to obey God. It's in our hearts now to do so. They're God's people, and He's their God. We belong to God, and we everyone in this new covenant, we know that He's our God, and we're His people. All know the Lord, and thus no one needs to be taught to know Him. None of us who are in the covenant, who actually believe, need to be taught to believe now. We already do, and we already know God. We just learn. We need to be taught other things. So teaching still exists, but just not this specific thing, and that's what the text says. And we have our sins forgiven and are shown mercy. God does not remember our sins in this covenant. These descriptions do not describe the people in the Sinai Covenant, which is mixed with unbelievers. Now, these descriptions may describe some people, the remnant, and this is how the Old Testament describes it, the remnant within that covenant who are faithful. They know God. They are God's people. I believe they also have God's laws written on their hearts. Their sins are forgiven. All those things true of us in the new covenant were true of people who are truly believers under that old covenant, but it was not true of everyone in that covenant the way it is true of everyone in the new covenant. The new covenant has rendered the Sinai covenant obsolete, and thus at the time Hebrews was written, it was getting ready to disappear. This truth proclaimed in verse 13 is the real reason why so many in Torah movements seek to avert the context away from talking about covenants back in verse 7. It's not that it matters too much what's going on in verse 7 by itself. As we saw, like the fault thing, they're okay with, and Tim Hegg included, are okay with it saying weak and useless about the law because it's talking about the people. They're okay with that language. But the only reason it really hits home is because of verse 13, which then starts talking about things disappearing and becoming obsolete. And that they just can't have. And so, so the text just doesn't allow getting away from the fact that we're talking about covenants. What does this mean for us, though? Aside from answering opposing arguments, what does it mean that the Sinai Covenant is obsolete? Exactly. First, it does not mean that it's no longer Scripture, no longer teaches us, right? It's still the Scriptures. We still learn from it. It does not mean that every commandment found within it is no longer binding on believers. Some of those commandments reflect the laws that go all the way back, to Genesis, the laws written on our hearts. So some of those laws are moral, universal laws. They apply to everybody. And so that's that, just because you see it written in the law of Moses doesn't mean it is or isn't a law that's obsolete based on the covenant being obsolete. What does this mean for us, though? Aside from, reading that again. It does mean that some commandments, dependent as they are on that covenant, on that Sinai covenant, are no longer binding on believers. These commandments do have enduring effects in some ways, but they're not expected to be followed under a different new covenant. For example, Sabbath is still kept by believers by means of their belief, resting in Christ. I had an earlier part of this series where I talked about chapters 3 and 4 of Hebrews and how that we see that a Sabbath remains for believers, not the Sabbath is still in effect. That's not what the text says. And it explains what that Sabbath that remains is like. And it was, as Hegg pointed out, it's a sign of a different covenant. Since the Sinai Covenant is obsolete and has, disappeared at this point, so does its sign as its sign, that seventh day observance of the Sabbath. And that, again, that doesn't mean there's no wisdom in it, or that there's nothing good about resting, on every seventh day or something. None of that is what's in view here. The commandment, that it's required based on it being a sign of that covenant. Well, that covenant is no longer in effect. And if you've listened to me carefully, I don't make the argument that, oh, these laws are just for the Jews or just for Israel or things like that. No, I make the argument that those laws are tied to that covenant, which distinguishes that people from other people at that time, but it's based primarily on the covenant. And I've always argued that. A covenant disappearing is not the same thing as Scripture disappearing. The language of Hebrews 8:13 is not that of destroying, like what Jesus says in Matthew 5. He says, I did not come to destroy the law or the prophets. That's not what we have going on here. We have things growing old and disappearing. We're in a new covenant as believers, which means we live like people in covenant with God, and his universal eternal commandments are still in effect, while his special covenantal commandments are unique to this covenant and don't carry over from the first one. So I've said this many times that we, ceremonial law, what we call ceremonial law, is just that which was unique to that covenant. So Israel had ceremonial law under the Mosaic covenant that was unique to the Mosaic covenant. That's what ceremonial law is. So all the sacrifices stuff, kosher laws, the festivals, the Sabbath, rest, all of that. That's all unique to the law of Moses. It wasn't around before, and it doesn't continue after. However, we are not without a covenant. We are in a new covenant as believers. Our new covenant also has ceremonial law. So we do things like baptize new believers. We, partake in the Lord's Supper. We appoint elders. We preach the word. We, we make disciples of all nations. These are all things that are commanded of believers as believers. They're not things that are commanded of the whole world, as unbelievers. Now, there are plenty of laws that are commanded to all unbelievers, things like don't murder and stuff like that. That all applies to everybody, regardless of if they're a believer. But there's no text that condemns unbelievers for not taking the Lord's Supper. Does that make sense? Now, all unbelievers are commanded to repent and thus become a part of this covenant and thus be under these other laws as well. But so we have laws, but we live like people in this covenant, just not the other one. Now, I hope that detractors will address the substance of what I've argued and show if I'm wrong, pull up Hebrews, open up the text, and show me where the text proves me wrong. If I'm wrong, and I'm happy to take a look at that. That's really what I've been trying to do when I've looked at Hegg's commentary and throughout this series as I've looked at various arguments from that perspective. That's what I've tried to do. I try to find the best arguments from the other side that I can and really address them from the text. And I really do hope that other people will do the same. All right. So that is what I have for you today. I appreciate you guys sticking with me. It looks like we've gone just a little over 3 hours tonight, and it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. I do hope to continue in this series very soon. Start getting into 9, 10, 11. There's some great stuff in those chapters. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, the thing that I'm probably going to be most focused on here next month is doing this teaching in with Haps and Jeffrey Rice and those guys on it's called, what they're doing is called Passing the Torch. I know you can find information on it on Facebook if you're friends with those guys, or if you just follow them. So I don't know much else about it, but If either you guys are those guys is watching and wants to leave any comments about how to connect with you, that would be great too. Anyway, I hope you all are having just a wonderful evening. I'm gonna go to sleep now, and I appreciate you coming, and God bless, and we'll see you next time. See you in the next one.